She stepped off that stagecoach expecting a monster, a man hardened by grief who'd bought himself a servant through the mail. Lydia Mercer had fled one nightmare in Boston, only to walk straight into another, or so the town whispers promised. But when Garrett Hale looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said he didn't need a servant, he needed someone to stay, everything she thought she knew about survival shattered. Before we dive into their story, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these tales travel. Now, let's begin. The Montana wind carried the scent of pine and coming snow, cutting through Lydia Mercer's worn traveling cloak like it was made of newspaper. She pressed herself against the rough wooden bench inside the stagecoach, fingers clutching the single carpet bag that held everything she owned in this world. 23 years old, and she'd been reduced to this, running toward a stranger because staying meant something far worse. "Whoa there!" The driver's shout preceded the violent lurch as the coach wheels hit another rut in the primitive road. Lydia's shoulder slammed against the side panel, adding a fresh bruise to the collection she'd acquired over 3 weeks of bone-rattling travel. Across from her, an older woman in a feathered hat had been asleep for the past hour, her snores somehow audible over the thunder of hooves and creaking wood. Lydia pulled the letter from her pocket for the 100th time, though she'd long since memorized every word. The paper had gone soft at the creases, threatening to tear along the folds where she'd opened and closed it obsessively since leaving Massachusetts. "Miss Mercer, your application through the matrimonial agency has been accepted. I am a rancher of 32 years, owner of Silver Ridge Ranch in Montana Territory. I require a wife. The work is hard. The winter's harder. I offer a home, protection, and my name. I expect loyalty, capability, and discretion. If these terms are acceptable, arrive in Stillwater on November 3rd. Garrett Hale. No poetry. No promises of affection. Nothing like the flowery advertisements other men placed in the matrimonial papers, speaking of companionship and new beginnings. Just cold facts delivered in harder words. Lydia had read warmth into that directness when she'd first received it, sitting in her cousin Edwin's suffocating Boston townhouse. She'd thought, here's an honest man who won't dress up reality in ribbons. Now, watching the wild landscape roll past, endless forests giving way to golden grasslands, mountains purple in the distance, she wondered if honesty was just another word for cruelty. First time in Montana Territory? Lydia startled. The older woman was awake, bright eyes sharp despite her age. Her feathered hat sat askew, making her look like a curious bird. "Yes, ma'am." Lydia's voice came out smaller than she intended. "Come for a man, I'd wager. Mail order?" The woman's tone held no judgment, just matter-of-fact curiosity. "Don't look so shocked, dear. Half the women west of the Mississippi got here the same way. I'm Mrs. Calloway. My husband brought me out here 30 years ago. I was 19 and terrified." She leaned forward conspiratorially. "Who's the lucky fellow?" "Garrett Hale, of Silver Ridge Ranch." The change in Mrs. Calloway's expression was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around the eyes, a careful neutrality settling over her features. "Ah, Garrett." That single word carried the weight of volumes left unspoken. Lydia's stomach dropped. "You know him?" "Know of him. Everyone in Stillwater knows of Garrett Hale, though precious few know him personal-like." Mrs. Calloway adjusted her hat, seeming to choose her words with care. "He keeps to himself mostly. Good rancher, honest in his dealings, but what?" Lydia heard the desperation in her own voice and hated it. "Lost his first wife. Oh, must be 3 years back now. Childbirth. Baby didn't make it either." Mrs. Calloway's weathered face softened with genuine sympathy. "Changed him, they say. Used to be more sociable, but after, well, he rebuilt that ranch practically with his bare hands, works from dawn till dark, barely comes to town except for supplies, keeps a housekeeper who comes in twice a week, but otherwise lives out there alone." The stagecoach hit another rut, but Lydia barely noticed. Her mind was racing, recalculating. A widower seeking a replacement for his dead wife, a man hardened by loss, isolated by grief. What would he expect from her? What would he demand? "Don't look so pale, child." Mrs. Calloway reached across and patted Lydia's knee. I'm not saying he's cruel. Never heard tell of him raising his hand to anyone, just closed off, distant. You'll have security, at least. That ranch is one of the finest in the territory. Security. The word rang hollow in Lydia's ears. She thought she had security in Boston, too, living with her widowed Aunt Margaret after her parents died of influenza. Then Aunt Margaret passed last spring, and the house went to Edwin. Cousin Edwin, with his soft hands and softer voice, who'd cornered her in the library one evening and made it clear exactly what her continued residence would cost. She'd fled the next morning with the coins from Aunt Margaret's sewing box and the pearl earrings that had been her mother's, selling the earrings for train fare and little else. The matrimonial agency in New York had seemed like Providence, a way west, a way out, a way to anything but Edwin's sweating palms and entitled expectations. "Whatever you're running from," Mrs. Calloway said quietly, her eyes too knowing, "probably can't follow you out here. That's something, at least." Lydia managed a nod, not trusting her voice. Through the window she could see buildings now, rough-hewn structures lining a wide dirt street. Stillwater, Montana territory. The end of the line. The beginning of everything else. The stagecoach rolled to a stop in front of a weathered building with Stillwater Station painted across the front. Lydia's heart hammered so hard she thought Mrs. Calloway must be able to hear it. The driver appeared at the door, offering his hand. "Welcome to Stillwater, miss. Watch your step now." Her legs trembled as she descended, whether from weeks of travel or pure terror, she couldn't say. The November air bit at her cheeks, carrying the scent of wood smoke and horse. The street was busy with afternoon traffic, wagons loaded with supplies, men in work clothes heading toward what looked like a saloon, 2 women in practical dresses conferring outside a general store. Lydia Mercer? A round-faced man in a vest and spectacles approached, hand extended. "Samuel Porter, I run the stage office. Mr. Hale sent word you'd be arriving today. Said he'd come fetch you around 4 o'clock. You're a bit early, so you can wait inside where it's warm. Get you some coffee?" "Thank you." Lydia shook his hand, grateful for the kindness in his voice. "That would be most welcome." The stage office interior was sparse but clean, a pot-bellied stove radiating blessed heat, a few wooden chairs, a desk piled with ledgers and papers. Mr. Porter busied himself with the coffee while Lydia sank into a chair, her carpet bag clutched in her lap like a shield. Through the window, she watched the town's rhythms. A boy herded geese down the street. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in steady beats. Normal life, continuing as it always did, indifferent to one terrified woman's arrival. She thought of Edwin's last letter arriving at the New York rooming house 3 days before she boarded the westbound train. "You're being foolish, Lydia. Come home. We can discuss terms like reasonable adults." She'd burned that letter in the fireplace, watching Edwin's careful handwriting curl and blacken. There was no going back. There had never been any going back, not from the moment he touched her with those presumptuous hands. "Here you go." Mr. Porter pressed a tin cup of coffee into her hands. It was strong enough to strip paint, but blessedly hot. "You look like you could use it. That's a long journey from back east." "Yes, it is. She sipped carefully, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. "Mr. Porter, what can you tell me about Silver Ridge Ranch?" His eyebrows rose slightly. "Nervous about meeting Mr. Hale? I'd simply like to know what to expect." "Well," he settled himself against the desk, crossing his arms. "Silver Ridge is about 8 miles northwest of town, up in the foothills. Beautiful property, grazing land, timber, good water from the creek that runs through it. Garrett's got maybe 50 head of cattle, some horses, does most of the work himself, though he hires hands for roundup and branding." "Is he," Lydia searched for the right word, "fair as an employer?" "Absolutely. Pays on time, treats his workers square. Doesn't tolerate drinking on the job or laziness, but he works harder than any man he employs, so nobody grumbles much." Mr. Porter's expression grew more serious. "Look, I know you've probably heard about his wife, about what happened." Mrs. Calloway mentioned it. Catherine was her name, sweet woman. Everybody liked her. When she died, he shook his head. Garrett took it hard, real hard. Didn't speak to anyone for months except when necessary. Threw himself into the ranch work like a man possessed. We all thought he'd drink himself to death or work himself into the grave, but he just kept going, kept surviving. Does he... Lydia's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Does he have a temper? Understanding flashed across Mr. Porter's face, followed by a gentleness that made Lydia's throat tight. No, ma'am. I've never seen Garrett Hale raise his voice in anger, let alone his hand. He's stern, yes, not much for smiling or small talk. But violent? No. If that's what you're worried about, you can set your mind at ease on that score. Relief flooded through her, so intense it was almost painful. Not a monster, then. Just a man, a broken, grieving man who needed... What? A housekeeper? A companion? A replacement for what he'd lost? The clock on the wall ticked toward 4. Lydia forced herself to drink the coffee, to breathe steadily, to maintain some semblance of composure. This was happening. In minutes, she would meet the stranger she'd promised to marry, the stranger who held her entire future in his work-roughened hands. At precisely 4 o'clock, the sound of hoofbeats echoed outside. Heavy, measured footsteps approached the door. Lydia stood, her legs threatening to buckle, her hands gripping her carpetbag so tightly her knuckles went white. The door opened. Garrett Hale had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of physical labor. His face was weathered by wind and sun, all hard planes and sharp angles beneath a few days' worth of dark beard. He wore simple clothes, denim pants, a heavy coat, scuffed boots, a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed eyes the color of storm clouds. Maybe 32, as his letter claimed, but he carried himself with the wary stillness of someone much older. Those gray eyes found her immediately, and Lydia felt the weight of his assessment. Not leering like Edwin's gaze had been. This was different, careful, measuring, looking for something she couldn't name. Miss Mercer. His voice was deep, rough from disuse. Not unkind, but not warm either, neutral as winter stone. Mr. Hale. She was proud that her voice didn't shake. I've arrived as you requested. So I see. He nodded to Mr. Porter. Sam, appreciate you looking after her. Of course, Garrett. Her trunk's already loaded on your wagon outside. For a long moment, Garrett simply stood there, looking at her. Lydia fought the urge to fidget, to explain herself, to fill the silence with nervous chatter. His face gave away nothing. No pleasure, no disappointment, no reaction at all. Just that steady, unreadable gaze. Then his eyes shifted to her hands, still clutching the carpetbag, and something flickered across his expression, gone before she could identify it. Storm's coming, he said finally, turning toward the door. Let's get you home safe. Home. The word should have been comforting, but it hung in the air between them, strange and hollow. Lydia glanced at Mr. Porter, who gave her an encouraging nod. No choice now, but forward. Outside, a sturdy wagon waited, pulled by 2 dappled horses. Her trunk, small, battered, embarrassingly shabby, sat in the back. Garrett moved to the passenger side and extended his hand to help her up. His palm was calloused, warm despite the cold air. The grip was careful, neither too tight nor too loose. The touch of a man accustomed to handling delicate things, newborn foals perhaps, or fence wire that might snap under too much pressure. He released her the instant she was settled on the bench seat, then walked around to climb up beside her. The streets of Stillwater fell away behind them as they headed northwest. True to his word, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, pregnant with snow. The temperature was dropping by the minute. They rode in silence. Garrett's attention stayed fixed on the road, his profile carved from granite. Lydia studied him from the corner of her eye, trying to reconcile this silent, closed-off stranger with the future she'd committed herself to. He didn't look cruel, didn't look kind either, just absent somehow. Present in body, but with his thoughts far away. You had a good journey? The question seemed to cost him effort, as if small talk was a language he'd forgotten. Long, Lydia said carefully, but uneventful, which I suppose is the best one can hope for. First time west? Yes. Another silence. The wagon wheels creaked. One of the horses snorted. Lydia's hands twisted in her lap. It's different out here, Garrett said eventually. Harder than back east, Winters especially. You sure about this? Was he giving her an out? Testing her resolve? Lydia straightened her spine. I didn't come all this way to turn back at the first hardship, Mr. Hale. Something that might have been approval ghosted across his features. Garrett? Call me Garrett. We're to be married, after all. Lydia, then. She dared a glance at his face. When did you want to have the ceremony? Figured end of the week. Give you time to settle in, make sure you still want to go through with it. Reverend Morrison can do it Saturday if that suits. If she still wanted to go through with it, as if she had alternatives, as if she could waltz back to Boston and politely decline Edwin's attentions. But Garrett didn't know that, couldn't know the desperation that had driven her here. Better to keep it that way. Saturday would be fine, she said. The landscape opened up before them, rolling grassland dotted with stands of pine, mountains rising in the distance like sleeping giants. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that made Boston's manicured gardens seem suffocating in retrospect. Space, room to breathe, horizon that stretched forever. There, Garrett pointed ahead. Silver Ridge. The ranch buildings came into view as they crested a rise. A main house, 2 stories, built from logs that had weathered to silver gray. A large barn, corrals, a few outbuildings, modest but well-maintained, everything neat and purposeful. Smoke curled from the house's chimney. Someone had the fires going. Garrett drove the wagon straight to the front of the house and set the brake. He climbed down, then came around to help Lydia descend. Again, that careful grip. Again, the immediate release. Mrs. Fletcher, she's the housekeeper. Got a room ready for you. He hefted her trunk as if it weighed nothing, carrying it up the porch steps. Come on, I'll show you. The front door opened into a main room that served as both kitchen and sitting area. Simple furniture, handmade but sturdy. A stone fireplace with a good blaze going. Clean floors, windows that actually had glass in them. Luxurious by frontier standards, Lydia realized. Garrett Hale might be many things, but impoverished wasn't one of them. A woman in her 50s appeared from what looked like a pantry, wiping her hands on her apron. She had kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. You must be Miss Mercer. I'm Dorothy Fletcher. Welcome to Silver Ridge. Her warmth was such a contrast to Garrett's reserve that Lydia nearly wept with relief. I've got stew on for supper and fresh bread. You must be frozen through from that ride. Come warm yourself by the fire. Thank you, Mrs. Fletcher. That's very kind. Your room's upstairs. Garrett was already heading toward the staircase, her trunk still in his arms. Second door on the right. Lydia followed him up the narrow stairs. The second floor had 4 doors, all closed except the one Garrett was entering. She stepped into a modest bedroom with a real bed, not a cot, a proper bed with a quilt, a dresser, a small table with a basin and pitcher, and a window overlooking the front of the property. Garrett set the trunk down gently. He stopped himself. Started again. This is your room. You've got privacy. A bolt on the door. Use it if you want. I'm across the hall. The implication settled over her. Separate bedrooms. No expectations of wifely duties, at least not immediately. Another wave of relief. Thank you, she managed. This is more than adequate. Mrs. Fletcher comes Monday and Thursday mornings, does the heavy cleaning, helps with laundry. But day-to-day cooking and such, that'll fall to you if you're capable. His tone made it a question. I can cook and clean, yes. I managed my aunt's household for several years. Good. He moved toward the door, then paused, his back to her. Lydia, I know you don't know me, and I don't know you. I'm not looking for... He seemed to struggle for words. I don't need a servant. I need someone to stay. Someone who can build a life here. If you can't do that, better to know now. Before she could respond, he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. Lydia sank onto the bed, her hands shaking now that she was alone. I don't need a servant. I need someone to stay. What did that mean? What was he asking for? Through the window, she watched him cross the yard toward the barn, his long stride purposeful. A man perpetually in motion, as if stillness might let grief catch up to him. A soft knock at her door. Miss Mercer? Lydia? Mrs. Fletcher's voice. Supper's ready when you are, dear. I'll be right down. Lydia unpacked quickly, hanging her 2 spare dresses in the small wardrobe, arranging her hairbrush and the few toiletries she possessed on the dresser. Everything she owned fit in this one room with space left over. A whole life, condensed and transported, and still somehow not quite real. Downstairs, the table was set for 2. Mrs. Fletcher ladled stew into bowls, her movements efficient and practiced. "Mr. Hale's gone to see to the horses," she said. "He'll eat later, most like. Sits better with him to take meals alone." She gave Lydia a sympathetic look. "Don't take it personal, dear. He's been that way since... well, since." They ate together, Mrs. Fletcher chatting comfortably about the ranch, the town, the neighbors. Lydia learned that the nearest ranch was the Patterson place, 5 miles east, that Stillwater had a proper school now and a new doctor, that the winter of '74 had been so harsh, 3 ranchers lost half their herds, but Garrett had somehow brought all his cattle through. "He's a good man," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly, gathering the dishes. "Broken, but good. Treat him fair, and he'll do right by you." After Mrs. Fletcher left for her own home in town, Lydia found herself alone in the big house. She could hear Garrett moving around somewhere, the barn, maybe, or one of the outbuildings. She washed the dishes, wiped down the table, added wood to the fire. Domestic tasks that felt surreal in this strange new place. Night fell fast in Montana. By 6 o'clock, darkness pressed against the windows, held back only by firelight. Lydia lit the lamps Mrs. Fletcher had indicated, then stood uncertainly in the main room. Should she go upstairs, wait for Garrett? What were the protocols of this bizarre situation? The front door opened, bringing a gust of cold air, and Garrett with it. He stomped snow from his boots, the first flakes were falling, and hung his hat on a peg. His eyes found her by the fire. "You settled in?" "Yes, thank you. Mrs. Fletcher made sure I had everything I needed." "Good." He moved to the kitchen area, ladling leftover stew into a bowl. He ate standing up, his back partly to her, the silence stretching between them like an unbridgeable canyon. Lydia gathered her courage. "Garrett, I want to be clear about expectations. You mentioned not needing a servant, but I want to earn my place here. What would you like me to do? Beyond cooking and basic housekeeping?" He turned, surprise flickering across his face, as if he hadn't expected her to be so direct. "You can read and write?" "Yes, quite well." "Ranch accounts could use someone with a steady hand. I manage them, but barely. And the garden plot behind the house, Catherine used to keep it, but it's gone wild the past 3 years. If you've got any skill with growing things..." He trailed off. "I helped manage my aunt's kitchen garden. I'd be happy to restore yours come spring." "Spring's a ways off yet." He set his empty bowl in the dry sink. "You should know, Lydia, I'm gone most days, dawn to dusk, sometimes longer during calving season or if there's trouble. You'll be alone here a fair amount. I'm not afraid of solitude." "No?" Something in his voice suggested he understood that all too well. "Good. Because this ranch, this life, it's not easy, not what you're probably used to." "Mr. Hale, Garrett, I didn't come here expecting easy. I came here because I needed..." She stopped, not ready to reveal too much. Needed what? A fresh start. It was true, if incomplete. A chance to build something new. He studied her for a long moment, those storm-gray eyes seeing perhaps more than she wanted to reveal. Then he nodded, once. "Fair enough. We've both got our reasons, I reckon. We'll make it work or we won't." It wasn't a romantic declaration. Wasn't even particularly encouraging. But there was something in his bluntness that Lydia found oddly reassuring. No false promises, no pretty lies, just stark honesty about the uncertain road ahead. "I'll head up," he said. "Long day tomorrow. You need anything? I'm across the hall." "Good night, Garrett." "Good night." She listened to his footsteps on the stairs, the creak of his door, then silence. The fire crackled. Outside, snow whispered against the windows. Lydia stood in the center of this strange house that was supposed to become her home, married to a stranger who was supposed to become her husband, and felt the full weight of the leap she'd taken. But beneath the fear, beneath the uncertainty, was something else. something that felt almost like hope. He'd said he needed someone to stay, not someone to serve him, not someone to warm his bed, not someone to replace what he'd lost, just someone to stay. Maybe, Lydia thought as she climbed the stairs to her room, maybe that was something she could manage. Maybe staying was enough to start with. Maybe from staying, other things might grow. Through her window, the snow fell steadily now, covering everything in clean white silence. Tomorrow would be her first full day at Silver Ridge Ranch. Tomorrow, she would begin to build whatever this new life would become. For tonight, she was safe, sheltered. No Edwin with his presumptuous hands and entitled expectations. No desperate scramble for the next meal or the next safe place to sleep. Just quiet and snow. And the solid walls of a house that might, if she could find the courage to claim it, become home. Lydia changed into her nightgown, slipped between sheets that smelled of lavender and harsh lye soap, and closed her eyes. Across the hall, she could hear the faint sound of Garrett moving around his own room. Two strangers under one roof, bound by a contract, neither had quite dared to question too closely. The storm Garrett had predicted arrived in full force around midnight. Wind howled around the eaves, driving snow against the windows in icy waves. Lydia lay awake, listening to the house creak and settle, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of her new life. And somewhere in the darkness, she heard Garrett's door open and his footsteps on the stairs, heading down to check the fires, to make sure the house stayed warm through the night, making sure she stayed safe. I need someone to stay. Lydia pulled the quilt closer, and for the first time in weeks, felt something almost like peace. Morning arrived with pale sunlight cutting through the snow clouds, illuminating a world transformed. Lydia woke to the sound of someone moving around downstairs, methodical, purposeful sounds of a fire being stoked, water being poured. She dressed quickly in the cold room, her breath misting in the air, and descended to find Garrett already gone and coffee sitting warm on the stove. A note lay on the table in rough, practical handwriting. Gone to check the herd, back by noon. Help yourself to whatever you need. Lydia poured coffee and stood at the window, watching the sun climb over mountains she couldn't have named. 8 inches of fresh snow blanketed everything, softening the hard edges of fence posts and outbuildings. Beautiful and merciless all at once. This land that would be hers if she could prove herself worthy of it. She spent the morning exploring the house with the careful attention of someone taking inventory of a new battlefield. The main floor held the kitchen and sitting area she'd seen last night, plus a small office tucked behind the stairs, Garrett's domain clearly, with ledgers stacked on a battered desk and maps tacked to the walls. She didn't linger there, sensing it was private territory. Upstairs, besides her room and Garrett's, were 2 other doors. One opened to a simple washroom with a copper tub. Luxury indeed for a ranch house. The other door was closed, and when Lydia tried the handle, she found it locked. She was back in the kitchen, elbow deep in bread dough she'd mixed from supplies in the well-stocked pantry, when Garrett returned. He stamped snow from his boots on the porch, then entered bringing cold air and the scent of pine with him. "Smells good." He hung his coat, eyeing the bread rising on the counter. "You didn't have to go to trouble." "It's no trouble. I need to earn my keep." Lydia wiped flour from her hands. "How are the cattle?" "Cold but alive. Lost a fence post in the north pasture. Wind took it down. I'll need to fix it before the next storm." He poured himself coffee, leaning against the counter with the wary posture of a man unused to sharing his space. "You sleep all right?" "Well enough, thank you. The bed is very comfortable." "Good." He drank his coffee in silence, watching her work the dough. The silence stretched, but it felt different from last night, less hostile, more uncertain, 2 people learning the shape of each other's presence. "Garrett," Lydia said carefully, "there's a locked room upstairs. I wasn't prying, but I noticed it while I was—" "The nursery." His voice went flat. "It stays locked." The finality in his tone killed any follow-up questions. Lydia nodded, returning her attention to the bread. So that was where he kept his grief, sealed behind a locked door like something that might escape if given the chance. "Mrs. Fletcher mentioned you managed the ranch accounts," she said, changing subjects. "If you'd like, I could look at them. My aunt was quite particular about bookkeeping, and she trained me well." Garrett's expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or suspicion. "You know figures?" "I do. I managed her household budget for 5 years, kept all the records for her charitable donations, reconciled the banking statements. Lydia met his eyes steadily. I'm not just a pair of hands for cooking and cleaning, Garrett. I have skills that might actually be useful to you. Something flickered across his face. Interest, perhaps, or reassessment. The ledgers are in the office. They're a mess, I'll warn you. Numbers aren't my strength. Show me. He led her to the small office, pulling out a stack of ledgers that did indeed appear chaotic. Entries in different hands, some in pencil, some in ink, dates out of order, calculations squeezed into margins. Lydia flipped through the most recent one, wincing at the disorganization. I buy cattle in spring, sell in fall, Garrett explained, sounding almost embarrassed. Pay the hands weekly during busy season, monthly otherwise. Got expenses for feed, equipment, repairs. Income from the sales minus what the bank takes for the loan. It all works out somehow, but damned if I can ever make the numbers sit pretty on the page. You have a loan on the ranch? Northern Ridge, bought that parcel 3 years ago, right before he stopped. Borrowed from Rocky Mountain Bank to finance it. Bernard Clay holds the note. I've been paying it down steady, but it'll be another 2 years before it's clear. Lydia made a mental note of the name. May I try to organize these? I could create a proper accounting system, make it easier to track everything. If you think you can make sense of it, be my guest. He sounded doubtful, but not dismissive. Just don't spend all your time on it. There's plenty other work needs doing. I can manage both. She ran her fingers over the ledger pages, already seeing how she might reorganize them. Garrett, I want to be clear about something. I know this arrangement isn't conventional, but I intend to be a partner here, not a burden. Whatever needs doing, I can learn. He studied her for a long moment, those storm-gray eyes searching her face. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone quieter, more timid. The letter you sent to the agency, it was... He trailed off. Desperate? Lydia supplied, her chin lifting. It was. I won't lie about that. But desperation doesn't mean incompetence. No, he agreed slowly. I suppose it doesn't? He moved toward the door, then paused. Lydia, about Saturday. The wedding. If you're having second thoughts, I'm not. You should be. His voice carried an edge of something dark. You don't know me. Don't know what you're getting into. This ranch, it's isolated, hard, and I'm not easy to live with. Haven't been, not since Catherine. There it was, his dead wife's name, spoken aloud for the first time. Lydia saw the way he braced himself after saying it, as if the word itself had weight enough to crush him. I'm not Catherine, Lydia said quietly. I'm not trying to be her, and I'm not asking you to forget her. I'm just asking for a chance to build something new here, whatever that looks like. Garrett's jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't quite spit out. Finally, he just nodded. Saturday, then. I'll ride into town Friday, arrange things with Reverend Morrison. After he left, Lydia sat at the desk surrounded by chaotic ledgers and felt the weight of what she'd committed to settling over her shoulders. A broken man. An isolated ranch. A ghost she could never replace nor compete with. What had she been thinking? But then she remembered Edwin's hands on her waist, his breath on her neck, the trapped feeling of that Boston townhouse closing in around her. No, this was better. This was a choice she'd made, not a cage she'd been born into. She pulled the top ledger toward her and began to work. The days developed a rhythm. Garrett rose before dawn and disappeared into ranch work until dusk or later. Lydia kept the house, cooked meals that Garrett ate quickly and often alone, and spent hours organizing the catastrophic bookkeeping system. She discovered he was better off financially than his modest lifestyle suggested. The ranch turned a profit, the debt was manageable, and he had savings tucked away. He just had no idea how to track any of it properly. Mrs. Fletcher arrived Monday morning like a warm wind, full of chatter and questions masked as casual conversation. How was Lydia settling in? Was Mr. Hale treating her well? Had she seen the lovely chest of drawers in the spare room that Catherine had refinished herself? She was gifted with her hands, Mrs. Fletcher said, running a cloth over the kitchen table. Could make anything beautiful. The garden she kept out back, you should have seen it in summer. Roses, vegetables, herbs, all growing together like a painting. Broke my heart when it all went to seed. Lydia filed that information away. Tuesday afternoon, between bread making and ledger work, she bundled up and waded through the snow to the garden plot behind the house. It was bigger than she'd expected, maybe 30 feet square, surrounded by a fence that kept out deer. Beneath the snow, she could see the brown stalks of dead plants, the wooden frames of what had been raised beds. A trellis collapsed under winter's weight. She was standing there, planning what might be saved and what needed rebuilding, when Garrett's voice startled her. "I told you, spring's a long way off." She turned to find him watching her from the barn door, a hay fork in his gloved hands. "I know, I'm just planning, thinking about what I'll plant when the ground thaws." He crossed the yard toward her, his boots crunching in the snow. When he reached the garden fence, he stopped, staring at the dead plot with an expression Lydia couldn't read. "Catherine spent hours out here," he said quietly, claimed it helped her think. "I never understood the appeal. Seemed like a lot of work for some vegetables you could buy in town." "It's not really about the vegetables," Lydia said. "It's about making something grow, taking what's wild and giving it purpose." "Is that what you're trying to do here?" The question carried no accusation, just curiosity. "Take something wild and give it purpose?" "Maybe. Or maybe I'm the wild thing that needs purpose." She met his eyes. "Either way, I'd like to restore this come spring, if that's all right with you." "It's your garden now." He turned back toward the barn, then stopped. "There's tools in the shed. Catherine's gloves are probably still there too, if you want them." It was a peace offering, Lydia realized. Permission to claim something that had been his wife's, to make it her own. "Thank you." That evening, for the first time, Garrett sat at the table while she cooked dinner instead of disappearing until the meal was ready. He didn't talk much, just nursed a cup of coffee and watched her move around the kitchen with that careful attention she was learning was his way of getting to know things. "You're a good cook," he said when they were eating. "Better than Mrs. Fletcher, though don't tell her I said so." "Your secret's safe," Lydia allowed herself a small smile. "My aunt believed a woman should be able to feed herself and others properly. She made sure I learned." "Tell me about her, your aunt." It was the first personal question he'd asked. Lydia set down her fork, considering how much to reveal. "She was my mother's sister, took me in when my parents died of influenza. I was 16. She was stern but fair, taught me everything I know about running a household. She died last spring." "And then?" Garrett's eyes were too knowing. "What happened after she died?" "The house went to her son, my cousin." Lydia kept her voice neutral. "Living arrangements became untenable." "He mistreat you?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. She could lie, deflect, but something in Garrett's expression, a hardness around the mouth, a tension in his shoulders, told her he'd see through it. "He had expectations I wasn't willing to meet." Garrett's knuckles went white around his fork. "Did he hurt you?" "He tried. I left before he could do more than—" She touched her wrist unconsciously, remembering Edwin's grip. "I left. That's what matters." For a long moment, Garrett said nothing. When he spoke again, his voice was rough with barely controlled anger. "You're safe here, Lydia. I want you to know that. Whatever else I am, whatever else this is, you're safe under this roof. Any man lays a hand on you, he'll answer to me." The fierce protectiveness in his words made something crack open in Lydia's chest. "Thank you. Don't thank me for basic decency." He stood, carrying his plate to the dry sink. "It's what any man should do." But Edwin hadn't. Edwin had felt entitled to her, had seen her dependency as permission. The contrast made her throat tight. Friday arrived wrapped in gray skies and the promise of more snow. True to his word, Garrett saddled up mid-morning to ride into Stillwater and make arrangements with the Reverend. Lydia watched him go from the kitchen window, her stomach a knot of nerves. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she would marry this stranger and bind her life to his legally, permanently. She spent the day in a flurry of activity, baking, cleaning, organizing her few possessions. She had nothing appropriate for a wedding, just the two plain dresses she'd brought with her. She chose the better of the two, a dark blue wool that brought out her eyes, and spent the evening mending a small tear in the sleeve and pressing it as smooth as the sad iron would allow. Mrs. Fletcher arrived that evening, surprising Lydia by appearing at the door with a cloth-wrapped bundle. "Heard from Sam Porter that tomorrow's the day," she said, bustling inside. "Thought you might need something special." Inside the bundle was a beautiful lace collar, delicate as snowflakes. "Mrs. Fletcher, I can't—" "You can and you will. It was my daughter's, but she's got no use for it where she is now." Mrs. Fletcher's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She died 3 years back, same winter Catherine did. Consumption. I'd be honored if you wore it tomorrow." Lydia held the collar carefully, feeling the weight of shared grief, shared survival. "It's beautiful. Thank you." "You're good for him, you know." Mrs. Fletcher patted her hand. "I see it already. He's talking more, eating better. There's a light coming back that's been gone a long while. Don't give up on him, dear. He's worth the patience." After Mrs. Fletcher left, Lydia sat by the fire with the lace collar in her lap, watching shadows dance on the walls. Tomorrow she would become Lydia Hale. Tomorrow she would promise to love and honor a man she barely knew. Tomorrow everything would change again. Garrett returned after dark, stomping snow from his boots. "It's set. Morrison will do it at 2 o'clock. Just us and a couple witnesses. Figured you'd want it simple." "Simple is fine." Lydia's hands twisted in her apron. "Garrett, I want you to know I'll be a good wife. Maybe not in all the ways you might want. But I'll be loyal and honest, and I'll work hard for this ranch. For us." He crossed the room until he stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes. "I'm not asking for more than you can give, Lydia. Whatever this is between us, we'll figure it out as we go. No expectations beyond what we've already agreed to." "What have we agreed to?" "Partnership. Someone to stay." He lifted his hand like he might touch her face, then let it fall. "That's enough to start with." That night, Lydia lay awake listening to the house settle, listening to Garrett move around in his room across the hall. Tomorrow would mark the end of one life and the beginning of another. No going back to Boston, to Edwin, to everything she'd known. Only forward, into this strange new world with this strange, damaged man who'd offered her shelter when she had nowhere else to go. She must have slept eventually because she woke to sunlight and the smell of coffee. Her wedding day. Lydia rose and dressed carefully, pinning the lace collar to her blue dress, arranging her hair as neatly as her shaking hands would allow. When she looked in the small mirror, a stranger stared back, pale, serious, terrified. Downstairs, Garrett was already dressed in what must be his Sunday clothes. Clean denim pants, a pressed shirt, a vest she hadn't seen before. He'd shaved, revealing the strong line of his jaw, and his hair was combed back though it fought the order. He looked almost handsome when he wasn't scowling. "You look nice," he said gruffly. "So do you." The ride to Stillwater passed in tense silence. The day was cold but clear, sunlight glittering off yesterday's snow. Other wagons appeared on the road as they neared town. Saturday brought folks in for supplies and socializing. Lydia saw curious stares, whispered conversations behind gloved hands. The mail-order bride and the widower. What a story they must make. The church was a simple wooden structure with a crooked steeple. Reverend Morrison met them at the door, a kindly man with white hair and laugh lines around his eyes. Mr. Porter was there to serve as witness, along with a woman Lydia didn't recognize who introduced herself as the Reverend's wife. "Shall we begin?" Reverend Morrison gestured them to stand before the plain wooden altar. The ceremony was brief, almost businesslike. The familiar words, love, honor, cherish, until death, felt surreal spoken in this frontier church, binding her to this near stranger. When Morrison asked if anyone objected, Lydia half expected someone to stand up, to point out the absurdity of this arrangement. But no one did. The Reverend prompted Garrett for his vows. "I do." His voice was steady, his eyes on hers. Then it was Lydia's turn. 2 words that would change everything. "I do. By the power vested in me by Montana Territory, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Garrett, you may kiss your bride." Garrett hesitated, clearly not having considered this moment. Lydia saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the question. She gave a tiny nod. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers. Brief, chaste, but warm. When he pulled back, something in his expression had shifted. Softer, maybe. Or just more present. Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Hale, Reverend Morrison beamed. May God bless your union. They signed the register, Lydia's hand shaking so badly her signature looked like a child's scrawl, and accepted congratulations from the small gathering. Mrs. Morrison hugged her, pressing a small Bible into her hands. Mr. Porter pumped Garrett's hand enthusiastically, and then they were walking back out into the cold afternoon, married now, bound by law and church. Should we stay for supper in town? Garrett asked as they climbed into the wagon. Celebrate properly? I'd rather go home, Lydia said, then caught herself. If that's all right? Yeah. He picked up the reins. Home sounds good. The ride back felt different. Maybe it was the gold band now circling Lydia's finger, simple, unadorned, but real. Maybe it was the way Garrett sat beside her, not quite touching, but not pulling away either. Whatever it was, the air between them felt charged with possibility. At the ranch, he helped her down from the wagon with his usual careful grip, but this time he didn't immediately let go. His hand stayed at her waist, his eyes searching her face. This is real now, he said quietly. You're my wife. This is your home, for better or worse. I know. I meant what I said before. No expectations beyond what we agreed. We'll take this at whatever pace feels right. Lydia nodded, grateful for his patience, even as part of her wondered if he was simply that uninterested in her. But no, she'd seen the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching. Interest was there, buried under grief and caution, but present nonetheless. That evening they sat together by the fire, the first time they'd simply existed in the same space without work as a buffer. Garrett pulled out a piece of leather and a knife, working on what looked like a new belt, while Lydia mended one of his shirts that had torn at the shoulder. Can I ask you something? Lydia said into the comfortable silence. Go ahead. The locked room, the nursery. Will you ever open it? His hand stilled on the leather. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, I don't know. Some days I think I should clear it out, move on proper. Other days I can't even look at the door without... He swallowed hard. She was so excited about that baby. Spent months getting everything perfect, and then it all went wrong so fast. What happened? Lydia asked gently. If you want to tell me. Garrett set down his work, staring into the fire. Labor went on too long. Doc Peters did everything he could, but the baby was positioned wrong, and Catherine, she bled too much. Lost them both within an hour of each other. His voice cracked. I held my son for maybe 5 minutes before he stopped breathing. Never even got to name him proper. Lydia's eyes burned with tears. I'm so sorry, Garrett. I failed them. The words came out raw. I was supposed to protect them, provide for them, and I couldn't do the one thing that mattered. That's not failure. That's tragedy. There's a difference. He looked at her sharply. Is there? Yes. Lydia set aside her mending and moved to sit beside him on the settee. Failure is when you have control and choose wrong. Tragedy is when the world takes choice away from you entirely. You didn't fail them, Garrett. Life just broke wrong. His shoulders shook once, violently, and then he was crying, harsh, gasping sobs that sounded torn from somewhere deep and damaged. Lydia did the only thing she could think of. She put her arms around him and held on. He clung to her like a drowning man, his face pressed against her shoulder, 3 years of grief finally breaking free. She stroked his hair and murmured wordless comfort, letting him shatter because sometimes shattering was the only way to start healing. When the storm finally passed, he pulled back, roughly wiping his eyes. Sorry, Christ, I didn't mean to. Don't apologize for being human. Lydia cupped his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. You've been holding that in too long. It needed out. You must think I'm weak. I think you're strong enough to grieve, which is harder than people realize. She let her hands fall. Thank you for trusting me with this. Something shifted in his expression. Walls coming down, maybe, or just a door opening a crack. You're not what I expected, he said again, but this time it sounded like praise. Neither are you. They sat there as the fire burned low, not quite touching, but not separate either. When Garrett finally stood to bank the coals for the night, he paused beside her chair. Lydia, I know we said separate rooms, but if you ever wanted, If you ever felt ready for something more, you just have to say, I won't push, but I won't pretend I don't want. He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. I'm attracted to you, just want you to know that. But there's no rush, we've got time. Heat flooded Lydia's cheeks. Thank you for being honest. I'll keep that in mind. That night, lying in her own bed with her wedding band glinting in the moonlight, Lydia thought about the broken man across the hall who'd offered her respect when she'd expected demands, who'd given her space when he could have claimed rights, who'd shown her his deepest wounds and trusted her not to twist the knife. She'd come here expecting a cold arrangement. What she was finding felt dangerously close to something real. Sunday dawned bright and bitterly cold. After breakfast, Garrett surprised her by suggesting they walk the property line together. Want to show you the full extent of what's yours now, he said. Plus, you should know the land in case you ever need to find your way. They bundled up and set out, their breath misting in the frozen air. Garrett pointed out landmarks. The creek that ran along the eastern border, the stand of pines that marked the northern ridge, the cluster of granite boulders where he'd once seen a mountain lion. He talked more than she'd ever heard him talk, his love for this land evident in every word. That's the parcel I bought with the loan, he said, indicating the rolling grassland to the north. Best grazing in the territory. That's what Bernard Clay wants. The railroad's planning a route through here, and that land would be worth 10 times what I paid. Will you sell? Not a chance. This ranch is my son's legacy. Even if he never got to see it, I'll die before I let Clay or anyone else take it from me. The fierce determination in his voice made Lydia's chest tight. Then we'll make sure he doesn't. Garrett looked at her sidelong. We? I'm your wife now. Your fight is my fight. Something like gratitude flickered across his face. Yeah, I suppose it is. They walked in companionable silence, following the fence line back toward the house. The sun was high overhead, turning the snowfields into a blinding expanse of white. Beautiful and harsh, just like everything else about this place. Lydia, Garrett said as the house came into view, I know this wasn't what you dreamed of when you thought about marriage. Hell, it probably wasn't even your second choice. But I want you to know, I'm grateful you came. Grateful you stayed. You've already made this place feel less empty, and that's more than I expected. It's more than I expected too, Lydia admitted. I thought I'd be just another piece of furniture in your house, another servant. But you've treated me like a person, Garrett, like someone whose thoughts and feelings matter. That's a gift I didn't know I needed. They stood there in the snow, facing each other, and Lydia saw the exact moment something shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The recognition that what had started as convenience might become something deeper if they were brave enough to let it. Garrett reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were cold but gentle, and when he smiled, actually smiled, showing the lines at the corners of his eyes, Lydia felt her heart stutter. Come on, he said. Let's get inside before we freeze solid. That evening, as Lydia worked on the ranch accounts and Garrett sat nearby repairing a bridle, a comfortable domesticity settled over them. This was what marriage could be, she realized. Not grand passion or fairy tale romance, but quiet partnership, shared space and shared purpose. The slow building of trust that might, given time, transform into something more. When she finally climbed the stairs to bed, Lydia paused at her door and looked back. Garrett was watching her from the bottom of the stairs, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. Good night, husband, she said softly. Good night, wife. The words felt less strange than they should have. Almost natural. Almost right. Lydia slipped into her room and closed the door, leaning against it with her eyes closed. 1 week. She'd been at Silver Ridge Ranch for 1 week, been married for 1 day, and already her old life felt like something that had happened to someone else. Tomorrow she would start properly organizing the accounts. She would plan the spring garden. She would continue learning the rhythms of ranch life and the contours of her husband's grief. She would build something here, piece by careful piece. Through the wall, she could hear Garrett moving around his room, settling in for the night. And for the first time since leaving Boston, Lydia felt something that might, with careful nurturing, grow into happiness. The fragile piece they'd built shattered on a Tuesday morning in early December when Bernard Clay arrived at Silver Ridge Ranch. Lydia was in the kitchen, up to her elbows in bread dough, when she heard the approaching horses. Through the window she saw 3 riders, a heavy-set man in an expensive coat leading 2 harder-looking men who had the bearing of hired muscle. Garrett was in the barn, and she watched him emerge at the sound of hoofbeats, his posture going rigid when he recognized the visitors. She wiped her hands and moved to the door, stepping out onto the porch despite the cold. Something in her gut told her this was trouble, and she'd learned to trust that instinct. "Hale?" The heavy-set man dismounted with the careful movements of someone unused to physical exertion. He was perhaps 50, with the soft face of a man who'd grown prosperous on other people's labor. "Didn't expect to find you home mid-morning. Thought you'd be out playing cowboy with your cattle." "Clay." Garrett's voice was flat, dangerous. "What do you want?" "Now, is that any way to greet your banker?" Bernard Clay's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Especially when I've ridden all the way out here to discuss business with you. Our business is concluded on the 1st of every month when I make my payment, which I've never missed, in case you're keeping track." "Oh, I'm keeping track, Hale, very close track indeed." Clay's gaze shifted to Lydia, and something oily slid through his expression. "And who's this lovely creature? Don't tell me you finally found yourself a woman willing to endure this godforsaken isolation." Garrett moved slightly, positioning himself between Clay and the porch. "My wife, Mrs. Hale, and she's got work to do, so if you'll state your business—" "Your wife?" Clay's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. "Well, congratulations are in order, though I must say, ma'am, you've married yourself to a man with significant financial obligations. I do hope he's been forthcoming about the debt he carries." Lydia descended the porch steps, refusing to be relegated to the background. "Mr. Hale has been completely transparent about the ranch finances, which I now manage, incidentally, and according to my records, we're current on all loan obligations with 3 months' payments in advance reserve." Clay's expression soured slightly. "A bookkeeper? How industrious. Well, Mrs. Hale, since you're so well versed in your husband's finances, perhaps you can help me make him see reason about my proposal." "What proposal?" Garrett's hands had curled into fists at his sides. "The railroad's coming through, Hale. Montana Central's finalized their route, and it runs right through that northern ridge of yours. They're prepared to make a very generous offer for the land. More than generous, considering what you paid for it. Hell, you could pay off your loan and have enough left over to expand your herd 3-fold. I told you last month and the month before that the land's not for sale." "Don't be a fool," Clay's veneer of pleasantness cracked. "This is progress, Hale. You can't stop it. The railroad's coming whether you cooperate or not. Better to sell now and profit than have them condemn the land and take it anyway." Lydia's mind raced. Eminent domain, she'd read about it in the Boston newspapers, how railroad companies were seizing land across the West with government backing. On what grounds would they condemn it? The route isn't finalized, and there are alternative paths that don't require appropriating private property. Clay's attention snapped to her, and she saw calculation in his eyes. Alternative routes would add significant cost and delay. The most efficient path runs through the northern ridge. Montana Central has petitioned the territorial government for authorization to acquire the necessary parcels. "Acquire or seize?" Garrett's voice was deadly quiet. "Semantics. The point is, Hale, you're standing in the way of economic development. The railroad brings jobs, commerce, civilization to this territory. One stubborn rancher's attachment to a piece of land doesn't outweigh the greater good." "The greater good." Garrett took a step forward, and Clay's hired men tensed. "Or your commission on the sale? How much is Montana Central paying you to clear the route, Clay? 10%? 15%? Clay's face flushed red. "How I conduct my business affairs is none of your concern. What should concern you is that I hold the note on that land. And if you're not willing to sell, I might be forced to reconsider the terms of our agreement." "Our agreement is ironclad. I've read every word of that contract, and there's no provision allowing you to alter terms at will. Contracts can be interpreted. For instance, there's a clause about maintaining the property value. One could argue that refusing a sale that would benefit the territory constitutes negligent stewardship. Or perhaps we should discuss that fence repair on the southern boundary that's been delayed. Could be considered a violation of the maintenance requirements." Lydia saw where this was heading. Clay intended to manufacture a breach of contract, Use it as leverage to force a sale or foreclose entirely. The audacity of it made her blood boil. "Mr. Clay," she said, her voice cold and precise, "I suggest you review the territorial statutes regarding fraudulent contract enforcement. Fabricating violations to coerce property transfer is a criminal offense, and I'm quite certain the territorial judge would be interested to hear about such tactics." Clay's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Mrs. Hale. You've been in Montana territory all of 2 weeks. You might want to learn how things work out here before making threats." "That wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact." Lydia held his gaze steadily. "And I'm a fast learner. Fast enough to know that your conduct today constitutes harassment and potentially extortion. Fast enough to document this conversation in detail and submit it to the appropriate authorities if necessary." For a moment, genuine anger flashed across Clay's face. Then he smoothed his features back into that oily smile. "I see why you married her, Hale. She's got fire. Though fire can be dangerous, especially out here where help is so far away." Garrett moved fast, closing the distance between them until he was inches from Clay's face. "Get off my land, now. And if you or your men come back here making veiled threats toward my wife, I'll forget I'm a civilized man." Clay held his ground, but his hired men shifted nervously. "You're making a mistake, Hale. This won't end well for you." "That sounds like another threat." "It's a prediction." Clay turned toward his horse, gesturing for his men to mount up. "You've got until the end of the month to reconsider. After that, I'll be forced to take action to protect the bank's interests. And Mrs. Hale, you might want to ask your husband about the penalty clauses in that loan agreement, specifically the one regarding foreclosure proceedings." They rode off in a cloud of dust and snow, leaving Garrett standing rigid with fury and Lydia's heart pounding. She waited until they were out of sight before speaking. "What penalty clauses?" Garrett's shoulders sagged. "If I default on 3 consecutive payments, the bank can foreclose immediately without the standard grace period, and Clay has the authority to determine what constitutes default, including declaring the loan in violation if he deems the collateral compromised. That's unconscionable. No legitimate bank would include such predatory terms. Rocky Mountain Bank isn't particularly legitimate. Clay owns it, runs it however he sees fit. When I needed capital to buy that ridge, he was the only one willing to lend. I knew the terms were harsh, but I was..." He stopped, his jaw working. "I was desperate to expand before the baby came. Wanted to build something substantial to leave him." Lydia touched his arm gently. "We'll find a way through this." "There is no way. Clay's got the law on his side or enough money to buy it. If he wants this land, he'll take it. I can fight, but I'll lose everything in the process. The northern ridge, probably the whole ranch when legal fees pile up." "No." The word came out harder than Lydia intended. "No, he won't. There's always a way, Garrett. We just have to find it." He looked at her with something between hope and despair. "You don't know what you're up against." "Then teach me." Lydia turned toward the house. "Show me everything. The loan documents, the land surveys, the correspondence with Clay, everything. If there's a weakness in his position, I'll find it." For the next 3 days, Lydia barely slept. She spread documents across the kitchen table, studying every word of the loan agreement, every territorial statute she could find in Garrett's small collection of law books, every map showing possible railroad routes. Mrs. Fletcher found her there Thursday morning, surrounded by papers and cold coffee. "Good Lord, child, have you been up all night?" "I'm close to something. I can feel it." Lydia rubbed her burning eyes. "There has to be a legal precedent, a loophole, something Clay hasn't considered." "And if there isn't?" "Then I'll create one." Mrs. Fletcher studied her with new respect. "You really love this place already, don't you? Or is it the man who owns it?" Lydia looked up sharply. "I barely know him." "That wasn't a denial." Mrs. Fletcher began tidying the scattered papers. "I've seen the way you look at him when you think no one's watching, and the way he looks at you, like a man waking up from a long sleep and not quite believing the world's still there." "He's still in love with Catherine." "He loved Catherine, yes, but she's gone and you're here. There's room in a heart for both grief and new beginnings, if a person's brave enough." Mrs. Fletcher paused. "What are you looking for in all this legal mess?" "Alternative routes for the railroad. If I can prove there's a viable path that doesn't require seizing Garrett's land, It undermines Clay's eminent domain argument, but every map I've found shows the northern ridge as the most direct route. Most direct isn't always most practical. Mrs. Fletcher pulled up a chair. My late husband worked survey for the territorial government years back. Railroad routes aren't just about distance. They're about grade, water access, bridge requirements. A path might be longer, but still preferable if it avoids costly engineering. Lydia's exhausted brain seized on this. Do you still have his survey notes, his maps? Boxed up in my attic, most like. I can bring them Monday if... I'll come to town tomorrow. Can you have them ready? You really think you can beat Bernard Clay at his own game? I have to try. Lydia gathered the papers with renewed energy. He's counting on us being ignorant ranchers who'll roll over when faced with legal pressure. But I managed a Boston household's finances for 5 years, including navigating disputes with contractors and municipal authorities. Clay's arrogant enough to underestimate me, and that's his weakness. That evening, Garrett found her sketching crude maps based on topographical descriptions from his survey documents. He set a plate of food beside her. She'd forgotten dinner entirely, and leaned over her shoulder to see what she was working on. What's all this? Alternative routes, Lydia pointed to her rough sketch. If the railroad went southeast from Stillwater instead of northwest, they'd avoid the ridge entirely. Longer distance, but look, the grade is gentler, there's a natural pass through the mountains here, and the Little Boulder River would provide water access for steam engines. Garrett studied the map, his expression shifting from skepticism to surprise. How did you figure all this? Your survey notes mentioned these features. I just connected the pieces. She rubbed her temples. I need more detailed maps, engineering specifications for railroad construction, maybe testimony from an independent surveyor. If I can present a comprehensive alternative to the territorial government before they approve Montana Central's petition. Lydia. Garrett caught her hand, stilling her nervous movements. You don't have to do this. It's not your fight. Yes, it is. I'm a Hale now, remember? This ranch is my home, too. She met his eyes. Besides, I won't let that pompous bastard threaten us in our own yard and get away with it. A slow smile spread across Garrett's face, the first real smile she'd seen from him. You're something else, you know that? So I've been told. Lydia squeezed his hand, usually not as a compliment. It is from me. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither quite dared to name. Then Garrett cleared his throat and stepped back. I'll take you to town tomorrow. Mrs. Fletcher's place. Then we'll visit the land office, see what maps they've got on file. And I know a surveyor over in Helena who owes me a favor, might be willing to review your route proposal. Thank you. Don't thank me. You're the one doing all the work. He paused at the doorway. Catherine never cared about the ranch business. Said it was man's work, not her concern. But you've taken to it like you were born to it. After he left, Lydia sat staring at the maps, his words echoing in her mind. She wasn't trying to be Catherine, wasn't trying to replace her. But maybe that was the point. Maybe what Garrett needed wasn't a replacement, but something entirely different. Someone who'd stand beside him and fight instead of staying safely in the domestic sphere. Friday brought them to Stillwater in the wagon, the December wind cutting like knives. Mrs. Fletcher had 3 boxes of her late husband's survey materials ready, and Lydia spent 2 hours in the woman's warm kitchen pouring through faded maps and technical notes while Garrett handled business at the general store. This is exactly what I needed. Lydia carefully refolded a topographical map showing elevation changes across the territory. Look, the southeastern route I sketched has a maximum grade of 3%, well within railroad specifications. Clay's route through the northern ridge would require blasting through solid granite here and building a trestle bridge across this ravine. The cost difference would be enormous. Can you prove all that to the territorial authorities? I can try. I'll need time to compile a formal report, documentation, maybe technical drawings. Lydia's mind raced. The petition hearing is scheduled for December 28th in Helena, according to the notice Garrett received. That gives us 3 weeks to build an airtight case. Mrs. Fletcher's expression was troubled. Bernard Clay won't take kindly to you interfering with his railroad deal. I don't much care what Bernard Clay takes kindly to. From there they went to the land office, a cramped building that smelled of old paper and tobacco. The clerk, a nervous young man named Timothy, seemed both surprised and flustered by Lydia's detailed questions about survey maps and territorial acquisition procedures. "I can show you the filed maps, Mrs. Haley, but I can't let you take them. Regulations." "Can I copy them?" "I suppose, if you've got paper and pencil." For the next hour, Lydia meticulously copied every relevant map section while Garrett watched with barely concealed amusement. Timothy hovered anxiously, clearly unused to women taking such interest in land affairs. "Your wife's quite dedicated," he said to Garrett in a low voice, as if Lydia couldn't hear. "She's formidable," Garrett agreed, and the pride in his voice made Lydia's chest warm. As she worked, the office door opened and Bernard Clay walked in. His expression when he saw them went from surprise to anger to calculating neutrality in rapid succession. "Well, well, the Hales. Still tilting at windmills, I see." Lydia didn't look up from her copying. "Just exercising our right to review public records, Mr. Clay. Surely you don't object to citizens being informed about matters that affect their property." "Inform yourselves all you want. Won't change the outcome." He moved to Timothy's desk. "I need the Montana Central Survey files. The complete set." Timothy scurried to comply while Clay leaned against the counter, watching Lydia work. "You know, Mrs. Hale, I've been asking around about you. Interesting story. Boston girl from a good family, runs west to marry a stranger. Makes a person wonder what you were running from." Garrett went very still beside her, and Lydia felt the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. She set down her pencil carefully. "My past is none of your concern, Mr. Clay." "Maybe not, but it might be of interest to certain parties back east. Edwin Mercer, for instance. Your cousin's been making inquiries through business channels, trying to locate his missing relation. Quite worried about you, from what I hear." Ice flooded Lydia's veins. Edwin was looking for her. Of course he was. His pride wouldn't allow her to simply vanish without consequence. And Clay, that bastard, was threatening to expose her location. "That," Garrett said quietly, "sounds remarkably like blackmail." "Blackmail?" Clay's eyebrows rose in mock innocence. "I'm simply suggesting that Mrs. Hale might want to reconsider her opposition to progress. Be a shame if her cousin learned she was out here, especially given his concerns about her mental state and financial judgment." "My mental state is perfectly sound, and my financial judgment is better than yours if you think threatening me will work." Lydia stood, gathering her copied maps. "Tell Edwin Mercer whatever you like. I'm married now, legally beyond his reach or authority. And if you persist in this harassment, I'll file formal complaints with both the Territorial Marshal and the Banking Commission." "The Banking Commission?" Clay laughed. "Sweetheart, I have dinner with the Commission chairman monthly. Then I'll write to the federal authorities in Washington. Corruption in territorial banking systems is a matter of congressional oversight, particularly when it involves railroad development and public land." Lydia held his gaze steadily. "I may be new to Montana, Mr. Clay, but I'm not ignorant, and I don't scare easily." For a long moment, Clay simply stared at her. Then he turned to Timothy. "Those files, now." As he left with his documents, Garrett touched Lydia's elbow gently. "You all right?" "Fine." Her hands were shaking, but her voice stayed steady. "Let's get these maps home. I have work to do." The ride back to the ranch was tense. Garrett kept glancing at her, clearly wanting to ask about Edwin, but respecting her silence. Finally, as Silver Ridge came into view, Lydia spoke. "He tried to force himself on me. Edwin, after my aunt died and I had nowhere else to go, he said I owed him, for room and board, for family charity. Said no one else would want damaged goods like me." Her voice was flat, emotionless. "I left before he could make good on his threats. The matrimonial agency was my escape route." Garrett's knuckles went white on the reins. "If he comes here, he won't. Edwin's a coward who preys on the vulnerable. He'd never risk confronting an armed rancher on his own territory." Lydia looked at Garrett. "But Clay might try to use the threat as leverage. You need to know that before we go any further with this fight." "I don't give a damn about Clay's threats. You're my wife, under my protection. Let that bastard cousin or Clay himself try something. They'll learn real quick what Montana justice looks like." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made something crack open in Lydia's chest. For so long, she'd had to protect herself, fight her own battles, trust no one. The idea of someone standing beside her, defending her, felt almost foreign. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, Lydia worked late into the evening, organizing her research into a coherent argument. She was deep in calculations about bridge construction costs when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Garrett appeared in his nightshirt, hair tousled from attempted sleep. "You should rest. This'll all be here tomorrow." "I'm close. I can feel it." Lydia gestured to her notes. "Look, the southeastern route avoids 3 major engineering obstacles that Clay's route faces. The cost savings alone should make it attractive to Montana Central, even with the additional distance, if I can present this properly." "Lydia." Garrett crossed to the table, gently taking the pencil from her hand. "You're exhausted. You've been working 16-hour days all week. This fight's important, but not at the cost of your health." "I'm fine." "You're swaying in your chair." He pulled her to her feet. "Bed. Now. The maps will still be here in the morning." She was too tired to argue. As Garrett guided her toward the stairs, his hand warm and steady at her back, Lydia felt herself leaning into his solid presence. At her bedroom door, she paused. "Garrett, what Clay said about Edwin, does it change anything, knowing why I really came here? You think I care about your cousin's lies?" Garrett's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with heartbreaking gentleness. "You're brave and smart and stronger than anyone I've ever met. That's what matters, not whatever drove you west." Lydia couldn't help herself. She leaned up and kissed him. Not the chaste press of lips from their wedding, but something real and deep and full of all the feelings she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Garrett made a surprise sound. Then his arms came around her, pulling her closer as he kissed her back with 3 years of loneliness and longing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling for you," he said roughly. "Wasn't planning on it, tried to fight it, but there it is. You need to know that before this goes any further." "Good." Lydia's fingers tangled in his hair. "Because I'm falling too. Even knowing I'm still working through losing Catherine. Even knowing that. We're both works in progress, Garrett, but maybe we can be works in progress together." He kissed her again, softer this time, full of promise. Then he stepped back with visible effort. "Get some sleep. We've got a fight ahead of us. We'll win." "How are you so sure?" "Because we have to. Because this is our home, and Clay doesn't get to take it." Lydia squeezed his hand. "And because I'm not giving up the first place I've ever felt like I belonged." The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of research, writing, and revisions. Lydia compiled a comprehensive report arguing for the Southeastern Railroad route, complete with technical specifications, cost analyses, and environmental impact assessments. Garrett rode to Helena and returned with a statement from surveyor James Mitchell affirming the feasibility of the alternative route. Mrs. Fletcher recruited 3 neighboring ranchers to sign affidavits supporting the Hales petition. On December 27th, they loaded the wagon with Lydia's carefully organized presentation materials and began the 2-day journey to Helena for the territorial government hearing. The trip was brutal, freezing temperatures, rough roads, one night spent in a questionable inn where the walls were so thin they could hear every conversation in the building. But Garrett stayed close, his presence a constant comfort, and Lydia used the travel time to rehearse her arguments. The territorial courthouse in Helena was an imposing stone building that seemed designed to intimidate. Inside the hearing room was packed, railroad representatives in expensive suits, government officials at an elevated bench, spectators filling every available seat. And there, in the front row looking supremely confident, sat Bernard Clay. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale?" A clerk approached. "You're scheduled to present your petition after Montana Central's proposal. Please be ready when called." They sat through an hour of technical presentations from Montana Central's engineers, all supporting the Northern Ridge route through Garrett's land. The arguments were polished, professional, backed by impressive visual aids. Lydia felt her confidence wavering. What chance did her handwritten report have against this corporate machinery? Then Garrett's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. She looked at him and saw absolute faith in his eyes. He believed in her, believed they could win. "The territory will now hear from Mr. and Mrs. Garrett Hale regarding their petition for alternative route consideration. Lydia stood, gathering her materials with hands that only trembled slightly. She walked to the podium, faced the panel of government officials, and began to speak. Gentlemen, thank you for allowing us to present today. My name is Lydia Hale, and I'm here to demonstrate that Montana Central's proposed route, while direct, is neither the most practical nor the most economical option for territorial railroad development. For the next 45 minutes, she walked them through her research. She presented maps showing the gentler grades of the southeastern route. She cited engineering standards proving the northern ridge route would require extensive and expensive blasting. She provided cost comparisons showing the alternative route would ultimately save the railroad money despite additional mileage. She quoted territorial law regarding private property rights and the limitations of eminent domain. The panel members leaned forward, asking questions she answered with calm precision. She saw surprise on their faces. They'd expected a rancher's wife to make an emotional plea, not present a reasoned technical argument that challenged corporate engineers. When she finished, the room was silent. Then one of the panel members spoke. Mrs. Hale, you've presented a compelling case. However, Montana Central has already invested significant resources in surveying and planning for the northern route. What would you say to their argument that changing course now would cause unacceptable delays? I'd say that delays caused by inadequate initial planning are the fault of Montana Central's survey team, not the territorial government or private landowners. Better to invest a few months in proper route selection now than to discover costly engineering problems mid-construction. Additionally, the southeastern route I've proposed actually provides better long-term service to territorial settlements currently underserved by rail access. Bernard Clay stood abruptly. This is absurd. You're going to let some rancher's wife with a few hand-drawn maps override the work of professional engineers? Mr. Clay, the panel chairman said coolly, you'll have the opportunity to rebut in due course. Please sit down. Clay's face went purple, but he sat. The panel conferred in low voices while Lydia returned to her seat beside Garrett. He leaned close, whispering, "You were magnificent." The chairman rapped his gavel. The panel will take this petition under advisement. We'll review Mrs. Hale's proposal alongside Montana Central's submission and issue a decision within 30 days. In the meantime, all eminent domain proceedings are suspended pending our ruling. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was a stay of execution. As they filed out of the courthouse, Clay intercepted them on the steps. "Enjoy your temporary reprieve," he snarled. "When this panel rules in Montana Central's favor, and they will, I'll personally ensure the foreclosure on your ranch happens so fast you'll be homeless by spring." "We'll see about that," Lydia said calmly. But inside, her heart was pounding. They'd bought time, not won the war. The ride home felt longer than the journey out. Garrett was quiet, brooding, and Lydia knew he was calculating worst-case scenarios. That night, camped beside a frozen creek with stars blazing overhead, he finally spoke. "What if we lose? What if the panel rules against us? Then we fight the next battle, and the one after that." Lydia moved closer to the fire, accepting the coffee he offered. "Clay thinks we'll give up eventually. He doesn't understand that some things are worth fighting for no matter the cost." "And this place is worth it to you? After only 2 months?" "This place, yes. But also," she met his eyes across the flames, "also you. Us. What we're building here. I didn't come to Montana expecting to find a home, Garrett. I came expecting to survive. But somewhere along the way, surviving turned into living. And I'll be damned if I let Bernard Clay take that away." Garrett set down his cup and moved around the fire to sit beside her. He pulled her into his arms, and they sat together watching the stars wheel overhead, gathering strength from each other for whatever battles lay ahead. When they reached Silver Ridge 2 days later, exhausted and wind-burned, they found Mrs. Fletcher waiting with news. A letter had arrived from the surveyor in Helena. James Mitchell had connections with several members of the territorial panel and had been quietly advocating for the southeastern route behind the scenes. "He thinks you've got better than even odds," Mrs. Fletcher said. "Says your presentation impressed people who matter." It was the first real hope they'd had since Clay's threats began. That night, Lydia slept in Garrett's arms for the first time, both of them too tired for anything beyond holding each other close. but it felt like a promise. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. The next morning, Lydia woke to find Garrett already up, standing at the window of his room where she'd fallen asleep. She joined him, following his gaze to the northern ridge visible in the distance, snow-covered and beautiful in the dawn light. "That's where it would have gone," he said quietly. "The railroad. Right through the middle of the best grazing land in the territory. Would have cut the ranch in half, made it almost impossible to manage the herd. It won't come to that. You can't know that." "No. But I can believe it." Lydia wrapped her arms around him from behind. "We've done everything we can. The rest is up to the territorial government and whatever sense of justice they possess." Garrett turned in her arms, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. "I don't deserve you." "Yes, you do, and I don't deserve you. But here we are anyway." She smiled. "Guess we'll just have to make the best of it." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and Lydia felt the last of her walls crumbling. She'd come here expecting to trade freedom for security. Instead, she'd found partnership, purpose, and something that was beginning to feel remarkably like love. The 30 days of waiting felt like 30 years. January arrived with blizzards that buried the ranch under 4 feet of snow, isolating them from town for nearly 2 weeks. Lydia threw herself into work, organizing the accounts into immaculate ledgers, planning the spring garden in painstaking detail, learning from Garrett how to read weather patterns and anticipate the cattle's needs. Anything to keep her mind from circling endlessly around the territorial panel's decision that would determine their future. Garrett noticed her restlessness, the way she'd wake in the dark hours and pace the floor until exhaustion drove her back to bed. They'd been sharing his room since Helena, a gradual shift that felt natural rather than forced. But some nights she'd slip away and he'd find her at the kitchen table surrounded by maps and legal documents, searching for some strategy they'd missed. "Come back to bed," he said one frigid night in mid-January, finding her there at 3 a.m. with frost forming on the windows. "You're going to make yourself sick. I keep thinking there's something more we could do. Some argument I didn't make, some person we didn't talk to." Lydia's eyes were shadowed with exhaustion. What if I wasn't persuasive enough? What if they dismissed the whole thing as the desperate scheme of... "Stop." Garrett pulled her to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. "You did everything humanly possible, more than anyone could have expected. Now we wait, and we trust that truth matters more than Bernard Clay's money." "Does it? Out here?" "It has to." He tilted her chin up. "Because if it doesn't, then everything we're building means nothing. And I refuse to believe that." She buried her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him, wood smoke and leather and the faint sweetness of hay. "I'm scared, Garrett. I finally found something worth keeping, and the thought of losing it, we won't lose. Can't afford to think that way." His arms tightened around her. "You're the strongest person I know, Lydia. Don't forget that now." The next morning brought a break in the weather, and Garrett insisted they ride out to check the herd despite the snow depth. Lydia bundled up in Catherine's old riding coat. Garrett had offered it weeks ago, and she'd accepted after only a moment's hesitation, and they set out on horseback into the white wilderness. The cattle had weathered the storms well, clustered in the sheltered ravine where Garrett had driven them before the worst of the blizzards hit. Lydia watched him move among the animals with practiced ease, checking for frostbite and injury, counting heads to ensure none had strayed. This was his element, and she saw in those moments the man he must have been before grief hollowed him out, capable, confident, completely at home in this harsh landscape. "You're good at this," she called out. "Better than you give yourself credit for." He looked up from examining a heifer's hooves, surprise crossing his face. "It's just ranch work." "It's more than that. You've built something here, Garrett, something real and lasting. That northern ridge you're fighting for, it's not just land. It's proof that you survived, that you built a legacy even when everything fell apart." Something shifted in his expression, and Lydia saw the exact moment he understood what she was really saying. This fight wasn't just about property or money. It was about refusing to let tragedy define him forever, about claiming the right to move forward. "I never thought of it that way," he said quietly. "Always just seemed like stubbornness on my part, holding on to something because I couldn't bear to lose anything else. Maybe it started that way, but it's become something more." Lydia dismounted and waded through the snow to stand beside him. You're fighting for our future now, not just your past. Our future. He tested the words like they were foreign, still getting used to thinking in those terms. Me too. She leaned against his shoulder. But I like it. They rode back as the sun was setting, painting the snowfields gold and pink. At the barn, while Garrett tended the horses, Lydia noticed something she'd somehow missed before. A door at the back, partially hidden behind old tack and stored equipment. When she pulled it open, she found a workshop. Dust-covered tools hung on the walls, and a half-finished rocking chair sat in the corner, abandoned mid-construction. I didn't know you did woodworking. She ran her fingers over the smooth armrest, admiring the craftsmanship. Garrett appeared behind her, his expression going carefully blank. Used to. Haven't touched it since... He trailed off. Since Catherine? I was making that for the nursery. Never finished it after... His voice cracked. Couldn't bring myself to go back in there. Lydia studied the rocking chair, seeing the love and hope that had gone into every careful joint, every smoothed surface. It's beautiful, Garrett. You should finish it. What's the point? There's no baby to... He stopped himself, pain flickering across his face. Maybe not now, but someday there might be. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Lydia hadn't meant to say them aloud, but now that she had, she couldn't take them back. If you wanted. If we wanted. Garrett's eyes widened. Lydia, I can't ask you to. I mean, after what happened to Catherine, the thought of putting someone I care about through that danger. You're not asking. I'm offering. She moved closer, taking his hands. I know you're scared. God knows I'm terrified too. But fear doesn't get to make all our decisions. And if we want children someday, we deserve to have that chance without Catherine's tragedy hanging over us like a curse. I couldn't survive losing you, not after... His voice broke completely. I'm in love with you, Lydia. Completely, terrifyingly in love with you. And the thought of risking your life, then we'll be careful. We'll get the best doctor money can buy when the time comes. But Garrett, life is risk. Coming here was a risk. Fighting Clay is a risk. Loving each other is the biggest risk of all. She cupped his face in her hands. But I'd rather live a full life with risk than a half-life playing it safe. He kissed her then with a desperation that stole her breath, backing her against the workshop wall as months of restrained desire finally broke free. His hands tangled in her hair, her body pressed against his, and for long moments there was nothing but heat and hunger and the overwhelming need to be closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. I love you. Need you to hear me say it properly. I love you too. Have for weeks. Was just too scared to admit it. Not scared anymore? Terrified. But doing it anyway. She smiled against his lips. That's how you know it's real. That night they made love properly for the first time. No barriers of grief or caution between them. Afterward, lying tangled together in Garrett's bed with moonlight streaming through the window, Lydia felt something settle deep in her chest. This was home. This man, this ranch, this hard, beautiful life they were building together. Whatever the territorial panel decided, whatever Clay tried next, she had this. They had each other. Garrett, she whispered into the darkness. The nursery. Would you show it to me? He went rigid beside her. I haven't opened that door in 3 years. I know, but maybe it's time. She rolled to face him. You can't move forward while you're keeping that room sealed like a tomb. Catherine deserves better than that. Your son deserves better. I don't know if I can. Then let me help you. For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then slowly, he nodded. Tomorrow. In the daylight. I'll need daylight. True to his word, the next morning, Garrett stood before the locked nursery door with the key in his trembling hand. Lydia stood beside him, her fingers laced through his, lending strength. Whenever you're ready, she said softly. He took a deep breath and turned the key. The lock clicked open with a sound like breaking bones. The door swung inward, revealing a room frozen in time. Pale morning light filtered through windows that faced east, illuminating a space prepared with love and hope. A crib stood against one wall, hand-carved and beautiful. Shelves held folded baby clothes, blankets, tiny shoes. A mobile of wooden stars hung over the crib, motionless now but clearly meant to dance in the breeze. And in the corner, gathering dust, was a changing table and dresser set painted soft yellow. Garrett made a sound like he'd been punched. Lydia felt tears streaming down her own face as she took in the careful preparations, the parents who'd never gotten to see their child sleep in this room. She was so excited, Garrett said hoarsely. Spent months getting everything perfect. I carved that crib myself and she sewed all the blankets. We'd come in here some evenings and just sit, talking about what he'd be like, what we'd name him, how we'd raise him. His voice broke. And then it all ended in blood and screaming and silence. Lydia pulled him into her arms, letting him shake with 3 years of pent-up anguish. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. They stood there for long minutes while Garrett wept for everything he'd lost. When the storm finally passed, he pulled back and wiped his eyes roughly. I keep thinking I should have done something different. Called the doctor sooner, taken her to Helena for the birth, I don't know, something. There was nothing you could have done. Sometimes terrible things just happen, and it's not anyone's fault. Lydia touched the crib gently. But keeping this room locked, keeping yourself locked in grief, that's not honoring them. That's just surviving, and you deserve more than survival. What would you have me do? Clear it all out? Pretend it never happened? No, remember it, honor it, but stop letting it control your future. She met his eyes. What if we kept some things, the crib you made, maybe some of the blankets, but changed the rest? Made this room something that looks forward instead of back? Garrett stared at her like she'd suggested burning down the house. Then, slowly, understanding dawned. You mean for... He couldn't finish. For our children. Someday. When we're ready. Lydia squeezed his hand, not replacing what you lost, just making space for what might come. He looked around the room again, and this time Lydia saw something besides pain in his expression. Hope, fragile and tentative, but there. I'd need help. Can't do it alone. You're not alone. Not anymore. Over the next week, they worked together to transform the nursery. They kept the crib and the Star Mobile, tangible links to Garrett's lost son. But they repainted the walls, replaced the curtains, added new furniture. Lydia found Catherine's sewing basket and used it to make new blankets, different colors and patterns that belonged to this new chapter of their lives. Mrs. Fletcher arrived one afternoon to find them elbow-deep in paint and promptly burst into tears. Oh, Garrett, I never thought I'd see you open that door again. Lydia convinced me it was time. He glanced at his wife, covered in yellow paint and smiling. She's got a way of making the impossible seem doable. That's what love does, Mrs. Fletcher said, dabbing her eyes. Makes you brave enough to try. The letter from the territorial panel arrived on January 28th, delivered by a rider who'd fought through a fresh snowstorm to reach them. Lydia's hand shook so badly she could barely open the envelope. Garrett stood beside her, his face carved from stone, bracing for bad news. She unfolded the official document and read in silence, her eyes moving faster and faster down the page. Then she looked up at Garrett, and he saw tears streaming down her face. Lydia? What? We won. Her voice was barely a whisper. Garrett, we won. He grabbed the letter, needing to see it himself. The formal language swam before his eyes, but the critical passage was clear. After careful consideration of all submitted materials, this panel finds merit in the alternative southeastern route proposed by Mrs. Lydia Hale. Montana Central Railroad is hereby directed to revise their plans accordingly. All eminent domain proceedings regarding the Northern Ridge property owned by Mr. Garrett Hale are permanently suspended. We won, he repeated, still not quite believing it. You did it. You actually beat them. We did it, together. Lydia laughed through her tears. Bernard Clay's going to lose his mind. They celebrated that night with a bottle of whiskey Garrett had been saving for a special occasion, drinking until the world seemed golden and possible. Lydia sat in Garrett's lap by the fire, both of them giddy with relief and victory. Tell me what you're thinking, she said, tracing the line of his jaw with her finger. I'm thinking I'm the luckiest man in Montana Territory. Maybe the whole West. He caught her hand and kissed her palm, You came here with nothing but a carpet bag and sheer determination, and you saved everything I've built. You saved me. We saved each other. She leaned in to kiss him. That's how this works. But their celebration was short-lived. 3 days later, Bernard Clay arrived at the ranch with his hired men, his face purple with rage. You think you've won? He spat at Garrett. You think this is over? The territorial panel has ruled. It's done, Clay. Garrett stood his ground, Lydia beside him on the porch. The panel can be influenced. Decisions can be reversed. Clay's smile was vicious. And I still hold the note on your land, Hale. Don't think I've forgotten that. Our payments are current. You have no grounds for foreclosure. I'll find grounds. Trust me. Clay turned to his men. Check those fence lines. I want every violation documented. Every post that's crooked, every wire that's loose. We'll find something. For the next hour, Clay's men crawled over the property, measuring, photographing, making notes. Garrett and Lydia watched in helpless fury as they searched for any excuse to declare the loan in default. Finally, one of the men called out, Mr. Clay, found something. They all converged on the southern boundary where a section of fence had indeed collapsed, not from neglect, but from a fallen tree during the last blizzard. Garrett had planned to repair it as soon as the weather cleared. Failure to maintain property boundaries, Clay said triumphantly. Clear violation of the loan terms. I'm declaring this note in default, effective immediately. That's insane, Lydia stepped forward. That fence came down in a storm 3 days ago. The loan agreement allows reasonable time for weather-related repairs. Reasonable is a matter of interpretation. And as the loan holder, my interpretation is the one that counts. Clay pulled out a folded document. You have 30 days to pay the full balance of the loan, $14,000. Or I'll foreclose and take the entire northern ridge. $14,000. An impossible sum. Even with their savings and the upcoming cattle sales, they'd never raise that much in 30 days. Garrett's face went white. You can't do this. I just did. See you in 30 days, Hale. Better start packing. Clay mounted his horse, looking back with a satisfied smirk. Oh, and Mrs. Hale, your cousin sends his regards. He was very interested to learn about your whereabouts. Might be paying you a visit soon. They rode off, leaving Garrett and Lydia standing in the snow, their victory turned to ashes. Bastard, Garrett said hoarsely. He planned this, probably had his men sabotage that fence themselves. Can we prove it? Not in time. Even if we could, he owns the judge, the sheriff, half the territory. Garrett turned away, his shoulders slumping. It's over. I can't raise $14,000 in 30 days. Hell, I couldn't raise it in 30 months. But Lydia's mind was already racing. The cattle, if we sold them all, would bring maybe $5,000 at current market prices. Not enough. The southern parcels, then, could we sell them to raise their mortgage too, just not to Clay, and selling would take months. Garrett looked at her with devastation in his eyes. I'm going to lose it all. The ridge, probably the whole ranch, everything I built, everything we fought for. No, Lydia's voice was hard. No, he doesn't get to win like this. There has to be a way. There isn't. Clay made sure of that. Garrett's laugh was bitter. I should have sold when he first asked. At least then I'd have gotten something. Now I'll lose it for nothing. Stop. Lydia grabbed his shoulders. Don't you dare give up now. We beat the railroad. We can beat this. How? We don't have the money, can't raise it in time, and Clay holds all the cards. She didn't have an answer. Not yet. But she refused to accept defeat. Not after they'd come so far. That night, while Garrett descended into dark despair, Lydia pulled out every financial document they had and began searching for options. Sell the horses? Not enough. Borrow from neighbors? They were all struggling themselves. Take out another loan? No bank would advance that much so quickly. Appeal to the territorial authorities? Clay's corruption ran too deep. She was still searching when dawn broke, her eyes burning with exhaustion. Garrett found her slumped over the kitchen table, surrounded by useless calculations. Come to bed, he said quietly. It's hopeless, Lydia. Better to accept it now. I won't accept it. I can't. She looked up at him with fierce determination. There's always another option, always another way. I just have to find it. But as the days passed and the deadline crept closer, Even Lydia's resolve began to crack. They explored every possibility, contacted every potential lender, considered every desperate scheme. Nothing came close to raising the needed sum. 2 weeks before the deadline, Lydia was in town picking up supplies when she overheard a conversation in the general store. A group of ranchers were discussing a cattle buyers consortium coming through Helena next month, offering premium prices for large herds. "Too bad it's not happening sooner," one rancher said. "Could solve a lot of problems." Premium prices. Large herds. An idea began forming in Lydia's mind, desperate and possibly insane, but an idea nonetheless. She rode home faster than was safe and burst into the house where Garrett was reviewing bills they could no longer pay. What if we pooled herds with the neighboring ranches, drove them to Helena together for the buyers' consortium? The words tumbled out. If we could get premium prices for a large combined herd, our share might be enough to... The consortium doesn't arrive for 5 weeks. We have 2. What if we went to them instead of waiting for them to come here? If we could get word to them in Helena, convince them to conduct early purchases. "Lydia, it's a 2-week drive to Helena in good weather. In February, it's suicide. And even if we made it, there's no guarantee they'd buy early." Garrett shook his head. "I appreciate you trying, but what's our alternative? Sit here and let Clay take everything?" She grabbed his hands. "It's a long shot, yes, but it's the only shot we have." Garrett stared at her, seeing the fierce determination that had first made him fall in love with her. "If we try this and fail, we'll have wasted our last 2 weeks. Could have been using that time to salvage what we can. Or we could have been fighting to save everything." Lydia held his gaze. "I need to know we tried everything, Garrett, that we didn't just roll over and let Clay win." Something shifted in his expression, the return of the fighter beneath the defeated man. "You're crazy. You know that?" "Probably. But you love me anyway." "Yeah, I really do." He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. "All right. We'll try. God help us. We'll try." The next morning, they rode to the Patterson ranch and laid out their desperate plan. Initially, Michael Patterson thought they were insane, but when they explained about Clay's manufactured default and the buyer's consortium, his expression changed. "I've got no love for a Bernard Clay. Man tried to strong-arm me last year over water rights." Patterson considered. "I've got 30 head ready for market. If your plan works, I'd make double what I'd get locally. I'm in." Over the next 3 days, they recruited 4 more ranchers, pooling together nearly 200 head of cattle. Garrett sent a telegram to the buyers' consortium in Helena, proposing early purchase at a small discount in exchange for immediate sale. They received a terse reply. "Arrive by February 20th. We'll consider." February 20th was 13 days away. They had just enough time if everything went perfectly, which Lydia knew from bitter experience it wouldn't. The drive began on a bitter cold morning with 6 ranchers, 200 cattle, and prayers that the weather would hold. Lydia insisted on going despite Garrett's protests. "You've never done a cattle drive. It's dangerous, exhausting." "I'm going. This is our fight, and I'll see it through." She was already mounted, dressed in men's clothes borrowed from Garrett because her skirts would be suicide on horseback. "Besides, you'll need everyone you can get." He recognized the futility of arguing. "Stay close to me, and if I tell you to do something, you do it immediately. Understood?" "Yes, boss." She smiled despite her nerves. "Let's go save our home." The first 3 days went smoothly enough. Long, grueling hours in the saddle, sleeping on frozen ground, eating beans and hardtack. Lydia learned to anticipate the herd's movements, to spot strays before they wandered too far. Her body ached in ways she hadn't known possible, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. On the 4th day, the weather turned. What started as light snow became a blizzard, reducing visibility to mere feet. They lost 6 head in the whiteout, and one of the ranchers broke his arm when his horse spooked and threw him. "We should turn back," Michael Patterson shouted over the wind. "This is madness." "We're halfway there," Garrett called back. Turning back now means we lose everything anyway." They pushed forward through conditions that would have stopped anyone with sense. Lydia couldn't feel her feet in the stirrups, and her face was raw from wind and ice. But every time she considered suggesting they quit, she thought of Bernard Clay's smug face and forced herself onward. On the 8th day, the injured rancher developed a fever and had to be left at a way station. They were down to 5 drivers and nearly 190 head, the rest lost to weather, predators, and exhaustion. But Helena was only 3 days ahead if they could maintain their pace. That night, huddled around an inadequate fire, Garrett pulled Lydia aside. "You should have stayed home. This is too dangerous." "I'm fine," her teeth chattered, belying the words. "You're half frozen and dead on your feet." He wrapped his bedroll around her shoulders. "If something happens to you, it won't. We're going to make it, sell the herd, and save the ranch." She leaned into his warmth. "Then we're going to go home and never leave again for the rest of our lives. Promise?" "Promise." They made Helena on February 19th, the cattle gaunt and exhausted but alive. The buyers' consortium agreed to see them that evening, and Lydia stood beside Garrett in a Helena hotel room, covered in trail dust and probably smelling like cattle, while 3 well-dressed businessmen examined their herd. "They're in rough shape," the lead buyer said. "You've driven them hard." "Had no choice," Garrett replied evenly. "But they're prime Montana beef. You won't find better stock." The negotiation was brutal. The buyers knew the ranchers were desperate and drove a hard bargain. But finally, after 2 hours of back and forth with Lydia, interjecting strategic points about market values and quality standards, they reached an agreement. When the final tally was complete and the funds distributed, Garrett's share came to $9,300. Combined with their existing savings and everything else they could scrape together, it totaled $13,800, $200 short. Lydia stared at the figure, feeling everything they'd fought for slipping away. So close. They'd come so impossibly close. "I might have something," Michael Patterson said quietly. "My wife's pearl necklace. It was her grandmother's, worth maybe $300 if we can find a buyer quickly." "Michael, we can't ask you to—" "You're not asking, I'm offering. Clay tried to destroy me last year. Would have succeeded if I hadn't gotten lucky. This is a chance to hit back at that bastard. I'll take it." They found a jeweler willing to buy the necklace for $250. With shaking hands, Lydia counted out the final sum, $14,100. Enough. Barely, impossibly, but enough. They made the return journey in 7 days, riding hard with the certified bank draft that represented everything they'd fought for. When they reached Silver Ridge, there was 1 day left before Clay's deadline. Bernard Clay arrived precisely at noon on February 28th, clearly expecting to find them broken and defeated. His expression when Garrett handed him the bank draft was something Lydia would treasure forever. "That's the full balance of the loan," Garrett said calmly, "plus accrued interest. You'll provide a satisfaction of mortgage by end of business today." Clay's hands shook as he examined the draft, searching for some flaw, some reason to reject it. But the document was perfect, drawn on a Helena bank with full verification. He'd lost, and he knew it. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "I'll find another way to—" "You're done, Clay?" Lydia stepped forward. "I've documented every fraudulent action you've taken, the manufactured default, the threats, the attempted extortion, and I've sent copies to the territorial marshal, the banking commission, and a journalist friend in Helena who's very interested in corruption stories. You come after us again, and everything goes public." It was a bluff. She had no journalist friend, but Clay didn't know that. His face went from red to white to purple. "You'll regret this," he spat. "No," Garrett said. "I really don't think we will." They watched Clay ride away, defeat in every line of his hunched shoulders. When he was out of sight, Lydia's legs gave out, and she sat down hard in the snow, shaking with reaction. "Is it over? Is it really over?" Garrett pulled her to her feet and into his arms. "It's over. We won. The ranch is ours, free and clear." They stood there in the snow, holding each other as the enormity of their victory sank in. They'd fought the railroad, beaten a corrupt banker, and saved their home against impossible odds. Together. That night, Lydia woke to find Garrett's side of the bed empty. She found him in the newly transformed nursery, standing beside the crib he'd carved 3 years ago, one hand resting on the smooth wood. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked softly from the doorway. "Thinking about the future. About what we might fill this room with someday." He looked at her, and his smile was genuine and unforced. "Think you'd want that? Children running around this ranch, driving us crazy?" "I think I'd want that very much." She moved to stand beside him. Not right away. I need to recover from that cattle drive first, but someday, when we're ready, we'll get the best doctor. Take every precaution. His voice was fierce. I won't lose you the way I lost Catherine. You won't lose me. Lydia took his hand and placed it over her heart. I'm too stubborn to go anywhere. He laughed, the sound surprising them both. When was the last time genuine laughter had filled this house? But here they were, laughing together in a room that had once held only grief, planning a future neither had dared to imagine 6 months ago. The snow had stopped falling outside, and through the window Lydia could see stars blazing in the clear Montana sky. Tomorrow they'd start planning the spring planting. They'd repair the storm damage, expand the herd, maybe even add on to the house. They had time now. Time and peace and each other. I love you, Garrett whispered against her hair. More than I thought possible to love anything after Catherine. You brought me back to life, Lydia. We brought each other back. She turned in his arms. That's how love works. It saves us from ourselves. They returned to bed together, wrapped in each other and the promise of all the tomorrows they'd fought so hard to claim. Outside, the ranch slept under its blanket of snow, safe and theirs. Home. Spring came to Silver Ridge Ranch like a promise kept. The snow melted in earnest by late March, revealing the winter-battered land beneath. Lydia stood in the kitchen garden plot on the first truly warm morning of April, her hands deep in newly thawed earth, and felt something she'd never quite experienced before. Belonging so complete it was almost painful. You planning to plant or just stand there communing with the dirt? Garrett called from the barn door, amusement coloring his voice in a way that still surprised her after months of marriage. The man who'd greeted her with stern silence last November now teased her regularly, smiled often, and laughed like he was making up for 3 years of holding it in. Both, she called back. This soil is magnificent, Garrett. Catherine knew what she was doing when she built these beds. She saw him flinch slightly at his first wife's name. He still did sometimes. But the pain was gentler now, more memory than open wound. She'd be glad to see it used again. Always hated waste. Lydia had learned not to avoid mentioning Catherine. Pretending she'd never existed felt like a different kind of betrayal, and Garrett needed to know his past and present could coexist. Some nights he still talked about her, sharing memories Lydia received like gifts, not threats, just pieces of the man he'd been before grief tried to destroy him. Mrs. Fletcher arrived mid-morning with her usual basket of town gossip and fresh bread. You'll never guess what's happened, she said breathlessly, settling at the kitchen table while Lydia poured coffee. Bernard Clay's been arrested. Lydia's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. What? Fraud, embezzlement, about 6 other charges I can't remember. Turns out that journalist you mentioned to him started investigating, and Clay's entire operation was crooked from foundation to roof. Rocky Mountain Bank's being seized by federal authorities, and Clay's looking at prison time. Mrs. Fletcher's smile was satisfied. Couldn't have happened to a nicer fellow. I never actually contacted any journalist, Lydia admitted. It was a bluff. Well, someone did. Maybe one of the other ranchers he'd squeezed over the years. Either way, he won't be bothering anyone from behind bars. Mrs. Fletcher leaned forward conspiratorially. And there's more. That cousin of yours, Edwin Mercer, apparently showed up in Stillwater last week asking around for you. Ice flooded Lydia's veins. He's here? Was here. Past tense. Mrs. Fletcher patted her hand. Sam Porter got wind of what he was after. Seems your cousin made the mistake of bragging in the saloon about reclaiming his property, meaning you, and Sam made sure the whole town knew the real story. By the time Edwin tried to ride out to Silver Ridge, he had the sheriff, 3 ranchers, and half the town's husbands escorting him right back to the train station with a strong suggestion he never return. The sheriff helped? Lydia's voice was faint. New sheriff. Young fellow named Morrison, the Reverend's nephew. He takes a dim view of men who abuse women. Mrs. Fletcher squeezed her hand. You're safe, dear. This community protects its own, and you're one of ours now. When Garrett came in for lunch, Lydia told him about Edwin's attempted visit. She watched his jaw tighten, saw his hands curl into fists, but his voice stayed calm. Should have let me know he was here. Would have handled it permanent-like. The town handled it. That's what Mrs. Fletcher said. I'm one of theirs now. Lydia touched his clenched fist until it relaxed. I have a home, Garrett. A real home with people who'll stand up for me. That's more than I ever had in Boston. Still wouldn't mind 5 minutes alone with that bastard. I know, but he's gone. Clay's in jail, and we're here, safe and together. That's what matters. She pulled him down for a kiss. Besides, I have more important news. I'm late. Late for what? My monthly courses. 3 weeks late. She watched comprehension dawn on his face, followed by joy, then terror in rapid succession. His hands came up to grip her shoulders, trembling slightly. You're pregnant? You're sure? Not completely sure yet, but the signs are there. She covered his hands with hers. Are you happy? Or just terrified? Both. God, Lydia, both. He pulled her against him, his face buried in her hair. I want this so much, but the thought of losing you. You won't. We'll be careful. Get Doc Henderson out from Helena when the time comes. I heard he's the best in the territory. And Garrett, women have babies every day. Most of us survive just fine. Catherine didn't. I'm not Catherine. My body's different. The circumstances are different. You can't let what happened to her poison what's happening to us. She pulled back to look at him. I need you to believe we'll be okay. Can you do that? He searched her face for a long moment, and she saw him wrestling with 3 years of trauma and fear. Finally, slowly, he nodded. I'll try. And I'll be with you every step. Whatever you need. I need you to finish that rocking chair you started, and maybe make a cradle to match. She smiled through tears she hadn't realized were falling. Our baby deserves furniture made by their father's hands. That afternoon, for the first time since Catherine's death, Garrett went into his workshop and picked up his tools. Lydia heard the rasp of sandpaper, the careful tap of hammer on chisel, and knew he was carving their future into wood grain and joinery. Doc Henderson confirmed the pregnancy 2 weeks later during a visit to the ranch. He examined Lydia thoroughly, asked detailed questions about her health, and pronounced her strong and likely to have an uncomplicated delivery. Your wife's built for this, Mr. Hale, he said, snapping his medical bag closed. Good hips, healthy constitution, no complications I can detect. Barring unforeseen circumstances, I see no reason this shouldn't go smoothly. And if there are complications, Garrett's voice was tight, then I'll be here to handle them. I've delivered over 200 babies, Mr. Hale, and I've only lost 3 mothers. Those were extreme cases, bleeding disorders, breech presentations that couldn't be corrected. Your wife shows no signs of such issues. Henderson fixed Garrett with a stern look. I know what happened to your first wife. I reviewed the case notes, but every pregnancy is different, and living in fear helps no one, especially not your wife, who needs you calm and supportive, not terrified. After Henderson left, Garrett found Lydia in the garden, transplanting the tomato seedlings she'd started indoors. He knelt beside her in the dirt, not caring about his clean pants, and took her soil-stained hands in his. I'm going to trust this, he said. Trust you, trust Doc Henderson, trust that life can be good again without waiting for the other shoe to drop. It won't be easy, and I'll probably drive you crazy with worry, but I'm going to try. That's all I ask. She kissed him softly. We're going to be fine, Garrett. All 3 of us. Summer transformed the ranch. The garden exploded with life under Lydia's careful tending. Tomatoes climbing their stakes, beans winding around poles, lettuce and radishes in neat rows. She spent hours out there in the early morning cool before the heat became oppressive, weeding and watering and planning next year's expansions. Her pregnancy advanced without complications. By June, her belly was visibly rounded, and she had to let out her dresses. Mrs. Fletcher taught her to sew baby clothes, and soon the newly finished nursery was stocked with tiny gowns and blankets. Garrett finished the rocking chair and built a cradle that was a work of art, smooth as silk, with carved stars to match the mobile he'd made years before. One evening in July, they sat on the porch watching the sunset over the mountains, Lydia in the new rocking chair with Garrett's hand resting on her belly. The baby kicked, and Garrett's eyes went wide with wonder. That's strong! He's going to be a fighter. She, Lydia corrected. I think it's a girl. Either way. He leaned down and spoke to her belly. You hear that in there? You've got parents who want you more than anything. Don't keep us waiting too long, all right? The baby kicked again, as if in response, and they both laughed. These were the moments Lydia treasured, simple and domestic, so far from the desperate circumstances that had brought her here. She'd come to Montana expecting survival. Instead, she'd found joy. Garrett, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you ever regret it? Putting that advertisement in the matrimonial papers? Taking a chance on a stranger? He was quiet for a moment, considering. Not for 1 second. You saved my life, Lydia. Saved this ranch. Saved me from turning into one of those bitter old men who drink themselves to death out of sheer loneliness. You're the best thing that ever happened to me. Even better than Catherine? She'd never asked before, had been too afraid of the answer, but pregnancy had made her bold and she needed to know. Different than Catherine, he said carefully. Catherine was my first love, the girl I grew up with. What we had was sweet and easy, but you... He turned her face toward his. You're my second chance, my partner in every sense. You fight beside me, challenge me, make me better. What we have is hard-won and all the stronger for it. So no, not better, just different. And exactly what I needed. Lydia kissed him as the sun painted the sky gold and crimson, the baby moving between them, and felt her heart so full she thought it might burst. This was home. This was family. This was everything she'd never dared to dream she could have. August brought the harvest. Despite her growing belly, Lydia insisted on helping bring in the garden's bounty. They canned tomatoes and pickled cucumbers, dried beans and stored potatoes, laid up supplies for the winter months. The root cellar filled with proof of her labor, and Garrett teased that they'd have enough food to survive 3 winters instead of 1. I like being prepared, she said, wiping sweat from her forehead. After growing up dependent on others' charity, knowing we have abundance feels like security. We do have abundance. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands cradling their child. More than I ever thought possible. The Patterson family came for dinner one Sunday in late August, bringing their 3 children and news that they were expanding their own herd with profits from the Helena sale. Michael Patterson raised his glass in a toast. To the Hales, who taught us all that fighting back against bullies actually works sometimes. And to Lydia, the smartest damn woman in Montana territory. Hear, hear, the others echoed, and Lydia blushed with pleasure. After dinner, while the men talked cattle prices and the children played in the yard, Mrs. Patterson pulled Lydia aside. I wanted to thank you properly, she said. Michael told me what you risked to make that drive happen. You could have lost everything, including the baby you were probably already carrying. That took courage. Or desperation, Lydia said wryly. I'm not sure there's much difference sometimes. There is, though. Desperation is panicked and sloppy. You were strategic and brave. There's a difference. Mrs. Patterson smiled. You're going to be a wonderful mother. That baby's lucky to have you. The words stayed with Lydia as her pregnancy advanced into its final months. She felt ungainly and enormous, her back aching constantly, her ankles swelling in the September heat. But every discomfort was worth it when the baby moved, or when Garrett pressed his ear to her belly trying to hear a heartbeat, or when she folded another tiny gown and imagined the child who would wear it. October arrived with the first frost. Lydia was helping Garrett repair a section of barn roof, just holding tools, not climbing, despite her protests, when the first real contraction hit. She gasped and grabbed the workbench, and Garrett was at her side instantly. Was that? I think so. She breathed through it, the way Doc Henderson had taught her. But it's early. I'm not due for another month. Babies don't care about due dates. I'm getting Henderson. Garrett, it's probably false labor. First babies always... Another contraction, stronger this time, cut off her words. All right, maybe get Henderson. Garrett rode for Stillwater at a pace that would have worried Lydia if she wasn't too busy dealing with increasingly intense contractions. Mrs. Fletcher arrived first, summoned by a ranch hand Garrett had sent ahead, and took charge with brisk efficiency. Let's get you upstairs, dear. Into bed, where you'll be comfortable. She helped Lydia climb the stairs, chattering reassuringly about her own 4 births. Early isn't necessarily bad. My second came 6 weeks early and grew up strong as an ox. You just focus on breathing. Doc Henderson arrived 2 hours later with Garrett white-faced beside him. By then, Lydia's contractions were 5 minutes apart and intensifying. Henderson examined her quickly and nodded approval. Everything looks good, Mrs. Hale. Baby's in the right position. You're progressing normally. This is going to be quick for a first birth. I'd say you'll have a baby by midnight. Quick? Lydia gasped between contractions. This is quick? Trust me, I've seen labors last 3 days. You're doing beautifully. He turned to Garrett. You can stay if you want, but most men prefer to wait downstairs. I'm staying. Garrett took Lydia's hand, his grip almost painfully tight. I wasn't here for Catherine. I should have been. Should have done something. I'm not leaving Lydia. There was nothing you could have done for Catherine, Henderson said firmly. Her situation was a tragic anomaly. This is different. But if you're staying, you follow my instructions without question. Understood? Yes, sir. The next hours blurred together in a haze of pain and effort. Lydia had known childbirth would hurt, but the reality exceeded anything she'd imagined. She gripped Garrett's hand and Mrs. Fletcher's, breathing through contractions that felt like they might split her in half, while Henderson offered calm instructions and encouragement. You're doing wonderfully. Almost there now. On the next contraction, I need you to push. Lydia pushed with everything she had, screaming with the effort. Garrett's face was gray with fear, but he stayed beside her, murmuring encouragement even though his voice shook. That's it. You're doing it. I can see the head. One more big push, Mrs. Hale. She bore down with the last of her strength, feeling something give way, and suddenly the pressure released. A thin, angry wail filled the room, and Lydia collapsed back against the pillows, gasping. It's a boy, Henderson announced, holding up a squirming, red-faced infant. Healthy lungs, all his fingers and toes. Congratulations! A son, Garrett whispered, staring at the baby like he couldn't quite believe it was real. We have a son. Henderson cleaned the baby quickly and placed him on Lydia's chest. She looked down at the tiny, furious face, their child, their miracle, and felt tears streaming down her cheeks. He was perfect. Small, but perfect, with a shock of dark hair and Garrett's straight nose and eyes that would probably be gray like his father's. Hello, she whispered. We've been waiting for you. The baby stopped crying and seemed to focus on her face, one tiny hand waving. Garrett reached out with a trembling finger and touched that small hand. Immediately, the baby's fingers closed around his father's finger with surprising strength. He's got a good grip, Garrett said, his voice thick with tears. Strong boy. Just like his father. Lydia looked up at her husband and saw his face transformed by joy and relief and love so fierce it was almost frightening. We did it, Garrett. We're parents. You did it. You're amazing. He couldn't find words, so he just kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. Thank you. Thank you for this. For him. For everything. Henderson finished his examination and declared both mother and baby in excellent health. He's small but strong. Early babies often are. Keep him warm, feed him regularly, and he'll catch up to full-term size in a few months. He packed his instruments. I'll check back in a week, but I expect no complications. You did beautifully, Mrs. Hale. After Henderson and Mrs. Fletcher left, Garrett and Lydia were alone with their son. They lay together in the bed, the baby nestled between them, studying every tiny feature in the lamplight. What should we name him? Lydia asked. Garrett was quiet for a moment. I was thinking. Catherine and I never got to name our son. He died before we could decide. But there was one name Catherine loved. Would it be all right if we used it for him? What name? Thomas. It was her father's name, but only if you're comfortable with it. Lydia looked at the baby, then at Garrett. She understood what he was asking, permission to honor his first wife, to weave past and present together. Some women might have refused, might have seen it as a threat, but Lydia had learned that love wasn't a finite resource that had to be divided. There was room in their family for Catherine's memory and their living future. Thomas Hale, she said, testing it. I think it's perfect, but he needs a middle name too, something that's just ours. What would you want? Something that means hope or new beginning. She thought for a moment. What about Thomas James? James means supplanter, one who comes after and transforms things. That's what this baby represents, isn't it? Not replacing what was lost, but transforming grief into joy. Thomas James Hale. Garrett smiled, the expression lighting his whole face. Yeah, that's exactly right. Little Thomas proved to be a hungry, demanding baby who believed sleep was optional. The first few weeks were a blur of feeding and diaper changes and exhausted attempts to sleep whenever the baby did. But Lydia had never been happier, even when she was so tired she could barely stand. Garrett was a revelation as a father. He'd been so afraid of repeating the past that Lydia had worried he might keep his distance. Instead, he was devoted, walking the floor with Thomas at 3 in the morning, changing diapers without complaint, singing rough lullabies in his rumbling bass voice. She'd catch him sometimes just standing over the cradle, watching their son sleep with an expression of wonder and fierce protectiveness. I won't let anything hurt him, Garrett said one night, his hand gentle on Thomas's tiny chest. He'll grow up safe and loved, and knowing his parents would move mountains for him. He already knows, Lydia said, wrapping her arms around Garrett from behind. Look at him. That's the baby who feels secure. November brought news that Bernard Clay had been sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The story of his corruption had spread across the territory, ruining his reputation and dismantling his business empire. Montana's Central Railroad had approved the southeastern route Lydia had proposed, and construction was proceeding without disrupting any private ranches. You were right, Garrett said when they heard the news. Fighting back worked. We won everything. We did, didn't we? Lydia looked around their home, the cradle by the fire where Thomas slept, the ledgers showing their profitable year, the window overlooking land that was theirs free and clear. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, that I get to have all this. Our life, Garrett corrected, and you earned every bit of it. That afternoon, Mrs. Fletcher arrived with a box she'd found while cleaning her attic. These were Catherine's, she said, setting it on the kitchen table. Recipes mostly, and some letters. I thought Thomas might want them someday. To know something about the woman his middle name honors. Lydia opened the box carefully. Inside were handwritten recipes for bread and preserves, letters from Catherine's mother, a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet. Pieces of a life cut tragically short. Thank you, she said to Mrs. Fletcher. We'll keep them safe. Thomas should know his father loved someone before me, and that love made Garrett the man I fell in love with. Catherine's part of our family story. You're a rare woman, Lydia Hale. Not many would be so generous about a predecessor. Mrs. Fletcher wiped her eyes. Catherine would have liked you, I think, would have appreciated how you saved this place and the man she loved. That evening, Garrett and Lydia went through Catherine's box together. He shared memories each item sparked. The blackberry preserves recipe Catherine had perfected, the letter where she'd told her mother about being pregnant, the pressed rose from their wedding. I'm glad I can talk about her with you, Garrett said. For a long time I thought remembering her meant I was betraying you. But it's not betrayal, is it? Not even close. She helped make you who you are. That makes her part of us. Lydia held up a recipe card. And I'm definitely trying this bread recipe. It sounds delicious. December arrived with heavy snow and the first Christmas Lydia would spend at Silver Ridge Ranch. She decorated the house with pine boughs and holly berries, hung stockings for all three of them, and planned a feast even though it would be just their small family. On Christmas morning, Garrett gave her a leather-bound journal with her initials tooled into the cover. For recording things, he said. The ranch accounts, sure, but also recipes, garden plans, Thomas's milestones, whatever you want. Figured the first woman who saved Silver Ridge Ranch should have her thoughts preserved. Lydia's gift to him was a new saddle, hand-tooled by the best craftsman in Helena, with his initials and a small star pattern that matched the ones he'd carved on Thomas's cradle. So part of our son rides with you even when you're working, she explained. They spent the afternoon by the fire, Thomas on a blanket between them, talking about the year past and the one ahead. They'd plan a bigger garden in spring, Garrett said. Maybe expand the herd now that the railroad debt was gone. Build an addition on the house in a few years when Thomas needed his own room. I've been thinking, Lydia said, about starting a small lending library in Stillwater. Nothing fancy, just a room where people can borrow books. The town's growing, and children need access to education. Say, you want to start a library? Garrett's eyebrows rose. In addition to running this ranch and raising our son? Women can do more than one thing, Garrett Hale. She poked his ribs. Besides, I've got time, Thomas naps. And you're a surprisingly competent father when you're not working yourself to death. Competent, that's romantic. But he was smiling. All right, if you want a library, we'll build you a library. Anything you want, Lydia. You've earned it 10 times over. That night, after Thomas was asleep in his cradle and the fire had burned down to coals, they stood together at the bedroom window, looking out over the snow-covered ranch. The moon was full, turning everything silver and magical. A year ago, Garrett said quietly, I was alone in this house, half dead inside, just going through motions. Then you stepped off that stagecoach looking terrified and determined, and everything changed. You brought light back into places I thought would be dark forever. You saved me too, Lydia reminded him. I had nothing, no home, no family, no future. You gave me all three. We saved each other, Garrett. That's how this works. Then we're even? Not even close. I figure we'll spend the rest of our lives trying to outsave each other. She leaned into his warmth. Doesn't sound too bad, does it? Sounds perfect. As winter deepened and the new year turned, Silver Ridge Ranch settled into a rhythm of family life. Thomas grew from a tiny newborn into a chunky, smiling baby who delighted in grabbing anything within reach. The ranch prospered. The community embraced the small library Lydia started in an unused room above the general store. And Garrett slowly, carefully opened the rest of his heart to the possibility that happiness wasn't a betrayal of grief, but its transformation. One evening in late March, with spring returning and Thomas nearly 6 months old, Lydia found Garrett in his workshop. He was building a small rocking horse, sanding the wood with patient strokes. Starting early, aren't you? Thomas can't even sit up yet. Planning ahead. Figured he'll be ready for it in a year or so. Garrett looked up from his work. Besides, I was thinking, maybe Thomas shouldn't be an only child. Maybe in a year or two we could have another baby? Lydia finished, her heart lifting. You're not terrified anymore? Still terrified, but also excited. And I figure if we can survive everything we've been through, we can survive anything, even a second baby. He pulled her down to sit on his lap. What do you think? Want to do this again? I think I'd like Thomas to have siblings. Want him to grow up with family around him, not alone like I was. She kissed Garrett softly. But let's survive this first year before we plan the next one. Deal. Summer returned, and with it the first anniversary of Lydia's arrival at Silver Ridge Ranch. Garrett surprised her by declaring it a holiday. No ranch work, just family time. They packed a picnic and rode out to the northern ridge that they'd fought so hard to keep, Thomas secured in a sling against Garrett's chest. From the ridgetop they could see for miles, the ranch buildings nestled in the valley, the creek glinting silver in the sun, the mountains rising purple in the distance. Their land, their home, hard-won and cherished. This is what we were fighting for, Garrett said, gesturing at the vista. All of this. The land, sure, but more, the right to build something lasting, to have a future instead of just a past. And we did it. Lydia adjusted Thomas's bonnet to shade his face. We actually did it. You did most of it. I was just along for the ride. That's not true and you know it. You're the one who taught me about the land, trusted me with the finances, stood beside me when anyone else would have given up. She leaned against him, careful not to jostle the baby. We're a team, Garrett. Equal partners. Equal partners, he agreed. I like the sound of that. Thomas chose that moment to wake from his nap and demand attention with a lusty wail. They laughed and settled on the grass to feed him, watching the clouds drift overhead and the hawks circling in the thermals. A perfect moment in an imperfect world. Exactly what life was supposed to be. As summer faded into autumn and then winter again, the cycle of ranch life continued. They brought in another successful harvest from Lydia's expanded garden. The cattle herd grew. Garrett taught Thomas to wave and clap, delighting in every small milestone. The library in town became a gathering place for women and children, a space Lydia had created for community and learning. On a cold evening in January, nearly 15 months after Lydia had first arrived in Montana, they sat together by the fire. Garrett, Lydia, and Thomas, who was learning to walk by clutching furniture and taking wobbly steps. Mrs. Fletcher had come for dinner and stayed to help string popcorn for decorations. You know what strikes me? Mrs. Fletcher said. watching the family with satisfaction. I remember when you first came to this ranch, Lydia. You looked like a scared rabbit, and Garrett looked like a man carved from stone. Now, look at you. Happy, whole, a real family. We got lucky, Lydia said. Luck had nothing to do with it. You both chose this. Chose to fight for it, chose to trust each other, chose to build something new instead of staying trapped in the past. Mrs. Fletcher tied off her popcorn string. That's not luck. That's courage. After she left, Garrett pulled Lydia close on the settee while Thomas played with wooden blocks on the floor. She's right, you know, about the courage part. You were brave enough to risk everything on a stranger. I was barely brave enough to let you try. He kissed the top of her head. Best risk I ever took. Best risk we ever took, Lydia corrected. This whole thing only worked because we both kept choosing it. Every day, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Thomas abandoned his blocks and toddled over, pulling himself up on Garrett's knee with determined persistence. Garrett lifted him onto his lap, and the baby immediately grabbed for his father's beard, giggling when Garrett pretended to bite his tiny fingers. Lydia watched them together, her husband and her son, dark heads bent close, laughing at some shared joke she wasn't part of, and felt her heart so full she thought it might overflow. This was everything. This moment, this family, this hard-won home. She'd come to Montana expecting nothing more than survival, and instead she'd found a life worth living. What are you thinking? Garrett asked, catching her expression. That I never want to forget this, any of this. She gestured at the cozy room, the baby, the man she loved. 2 years ago, I was trapped in Boston with a cousin who saw me as property. 1 year ago, I was terrified on a stagecoach, heading toward a stranger who might be cruel. And now I'm here, with you, with Thomas, with a home that's truly mine. It feels like a miracle. Not a miracle, just life finally getting something right. Garrett shifted Thomas to one arm and pulled Lydia close with the other. And it's not over yet. We've got years ahead of us, raising this boy, maybe his siblings, watching the ranch grow, getting old together. All of it. Promise? Promise. You're stuck with me, Lydia Hale. For better or worse, richer or poor, all of it, until we're old and gray and complaining about our joints. I can live with that. She kissed him while Thomas patted both their faces with sticky hands. I can definitely live with that. Outside, snow began falling again, soft and steady, covering the ranch in fresh white. Inside, the fire crackled, and the lamplight glowed warm, and a family that shouldn't have existed found peace in the simple act of being together. Garrett looked at Lydia, his mail-order bride who'd become his partner, his love, his equal in all things, and saw his future written in her smile. Not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something entirely new, something earned through struggle and choice, and the daily decision to keep choosing each other. She'd arrived thinking he'd be cruel, expecting demands and coldness. He told her he didn't need a servant, he needed someone to stay. And she had stayed. Through fights with corrupt bankers and desperate cattle drives and the terrifying joy of bringing new life into the world, she had stayed. More than that, she'd saved him. From loneliness, from grief, from a half-life lived in the shadow of tragedy. She'd brought light back to Silver Ridge Ranch, and in doing so, she'd brought him back to life. I love you, he said, the words coming easier now after months of practice. Don't think I say it enough, but I do, more than I thought possible. I know. Lydia's eyes were bright with tears and laughter. And I love you, my stern cowboy who turned out to have the softest heart in Montana territory. Don't tell anyone. Got a reputation to maintain. Thomas yawned hugely and rubbed his eyes, signaling bedtime. They carried him upstairs together, tucking him into the cradle that would soon be too small, singing the lullaby that had become their nightly ritual. When he was asleep, they stood watching him breathe, this miracle they'd made together. Ready for bed? Garrett whispered. Ready for forever, Lydia corrected. They climbed into bed in the room they now shared fully. No separate spaces, no walls between them. Outside the window, their ranch slept under its blanket of snow, the land they'd fought for, the home they'd built, the legacy they'd preserve for their children and grandchildren yet to come. Lydia drifted toward sleep in Garrett's arms, warm and safe and completely at peace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Ranch work never ended, and spring would bring a whole new set of demands. But tonight, this moment, everything was perfect. She'd stepped off that stagecoach 15 months ago expecting a monster. Instead, she'd found a man wounded by loss who needed someone to stay. Not a servant, not a replacement, just someone willing to stand beside him and fight for something better. And she had stayed. Through fear and doubt and battles that should have broken them. She'd stayed, and in staying, she'd found what she'd been searching for all along without knowing it. Home, family, purpose. Love that grew from respect and partnership rather than obligation. A life that was truly hers, built by her own hands and choices. Silver Ridge Ranch wasn't just Garrett's legacy anymore. It was theirs, won together, defended together, expanded together. And it would be Thomas's someday, passed down with stories of the grandmother who'd made it prosper, the mother who'd saved it from theft, the father who'd learned to live again. But that was years in the future. Tonight, there was just this. The warmth of shared blankets, the sound of their baby breathing in the next room, the steady beat of Garrett's heart under her ear. Simple things that meant everything. Lydia? Garrett's voice was drowsy in the darkness. Thank you. For what? For staying, for fighting, for loving me when I didn't think I deserved it. His arms tightened around her. For everything. Thank you for needing someone to stay. She kissed his chest over his heart, and for being brave enough to let me. Outside, the snow fell soft and silent, covering old wounds with new possibilities. Inside, a family slept, mail-order bride and broken cowboy and the child who proved that endings could become beginnings, that grief could transform into joy, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply stay. The story that had started with desperate hope and frightened promises ended here, in peace and warmth and love that would last all their days. Not a fairy tale. Life on a Montana ranch was too hard for fairy tales. But something better. Something real and earned and absolutely worth every struggle it had taken to claim it. This was home. This was family. This was forever. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.